Welcome to Sleep for Stories. Thank you for joining us on this relaxing and mysterious journey. Let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future tales. Wishing you a peaceful listening experience and a restful sleep. Blackwood was the kind of town that time forgot. Nestled in a valley surrounded by dense, ancient forests, it was a place where nothing ever seemed to change. The same families had lived there for generations. The same local businesses served, the same loyal customers, and the same traditions marked the passing of time. But in the past 6 months, something had shifted. People were disappearing. It started quietly at first. A young woman didn't come home after a night out. The town assumed she had left for the city, tired of Blackwood's monotony then. A farmer who lived on the outskirts of town vanished one evening while checking his fields. The whispers began after the third disappearance. A schoolteacher, loved and respected, who never showed up for work one Monday morning. By the time her mutilated body was discovered 2 days later, the town was gripped by fear. The police were baffled. The few officers in Blackwood's small department weren't trained to handle something like this. Their investigations led nowhere, no suspects, no motives, and no explanations for the gruesome state of the bodies they found. Each victim was unrecognizable, butchered with a level of precision that suggested both expertise and malice. The killings weren't random, the townspeople murmured. There was a pattern, though no one could figure out what it was. The local newspapers dubbed the killer the Butcher of Blackwood, but no one wanted to talk about it openly. At night, the streets emptied early. Businesses shut their doors well before closing time, and people double-checked their locks before retreating to the safety of their homes. Yet, the darkness always seemed to creep closer, as if the killer thrived on their collective fear. It was on one such night, with the moon obscured by clouds and the forest whispering in the wind, that Emily Sullivan was walking home. Emily was 19, practical, and used to the rhythms of a fair, small-town life. She worked evenings at the local diner, saving up money for college, and she walked home every night along the same path through the center of town. Tonight was no different, or so she thought. Her headphones were on, her music drowning out the silence of the empty streets. The flickering streetlights cast distorted shadows on the cracked pavement as she hurried toward her house on Elm Street. As she walked, Emily felt it, that strange, prickling sensation at the back of her neck, the sense that someone was watching her. She pulled her headphones off and glanced over her shoulder. The street was empty. The diner's neon sign flickered in the distance, but there was no one behind her. No footsteps, no cars, nothing but the rustling of the wind through the trees. She shook her head and laughed nervously at herself. "Get it together, Em," she muttered, putting her headphones back on. She didn't see the shadow that slipped out of an alleyway behind her, moving silently along the edges of the street. As Emily approached the corner of Elm and Main, she noticed something odd. One of the streetlights ahead was out, plunging the intersection into darkness. It wasn't unusual for Blackwood's ancient infrastructure to fail, but tonight it felt different. The darkness seemed deliberate, oppressive, as if it were waiting for her. She paused at the edge of the light, staring into the black void ahead. Her hand hovered over her phone ahead in her pocket, debating whether to call someone. But who? The police? Her mom? She'd walked this way 100 times before and never had an issue. Telling herself she was being ridiculous, she took a deep breath and stepped into the shadows. The air felt colder here. The wind had died down, leaving the night eerily still. Her footsteps echoed faintly on the pavement, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. She quickened her pace, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. That's when she heard a faint sound behind her. It wasn't the wind, nor the distant hum of the diner's neon sign. It was deliberate, rhythmic, footsteps. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Slowly, she turned her head, her breath catching as she strained to see through the darkness. Atness. First, there was nothing, just the empty street, the faint glow of the diner sign far behind her. But then, a shadow shifted near the alleyway she had just passed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Emily didn't think. She ran. Her backpack bounced against her shoulders as she sprinted down Elm Street, her shoes slapping against the pavement. The sound of footsteps behind her grew louder, faster, matching her pace. She didn't dare look back. Every instinct, she didn't dare look back. Every instinct screamed at her to keep going, to reach the safety of her house just a few blocks away. The darkened streetlight loomed ahead, its broken bulb marking the boundary between light and shadow. She reached it and darted into the next pool of light, her chest burning as she gasped for air. She slowed, just for a moment, glancing over her shoulder. The street was empty again. Was it my imagination? Oh, she whispered, doubling over and placing her hands on her knees. Her lungs ached, and her legs trembled from the sudden sprint. Then she saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the darkness, just beyond the circle of light. It was tall, motionless, its face obscured by shadow, but there was something in its posture, the way its head tilted slightly to the side, that made her blood run cold. It wasn't just watching her, it was studying her. Emily's mind screamed at her to move. Emily's mind screamed at her to move, but her body felt paralyzed. She stared at the figure, unable to tear her gaze away. Then, slowly, it took a step forward, its footfall echoing unnaturally loud in the still night. She bolted, her scream lost in the wind as she ran toward her house, the figure following close behind. Emily's heart pounded as she tore through the darkened streets, her sneakers slapping against the pavement. She could feel the figure behind her, its presence a suffocating weight that pressed on her back. The faint sound of footsteps echoed unnaturally in the empty air, growing louder, closer, more deliberate. She didn't dare look back again. Her house was just 2 blocks away. She focused on the porch light that glimmered faintly in the night. And the glaze in this men frappering, and then they scroll on distance, her only beacon of safety in the consuming darkness. Just a little further, she whispered, her voice shaky and breathless. The figure's pace quickened, its steps eerily rhythmic, almost inhuman. Emily's lungs burned. Her lungs burned. Her legs trembling as adrenaline pushed her beyond her limits. Her backpack slid off one shoulder, tangling in her arm. She flung it to the ground without hesitation, hoping it might slow whatever was following her. The sound of the backpack hitting the pavement barely registered. The footsteps never faltered. She reached her driveway and stumbled, nearly falling as she scrambled toward the porch. Her shaking hands fumbled for her keys. She could feel the figure closing these distance, its shadow stretching toward her like a hand reaching out of the void. Her fingers found the key, and she shoved it into the lock, twisting desperately. The door opened with a groan, and she threw herself inside, slamming it shut behind her. She locked the deadbolt and pressed her back against the door, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. The silence that followed was deafening. She pressed her ear to the door, listening for any sign of movement. Outside, nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, just the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Emily staggered backward, her legs giving out as she sank to the floor. She hugged her knees to her chest, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her cow to his Mary mind raced with questions. Who was that? What did they want? And how had they disappeared so quickly? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, making her jump. She pulled it out with shaky hands and saw a text from her mom. Working late tonight. Be home after midnight. Stay safe. Love you. Emily let out a shaky laugh. The normalcy of the message, The normalcy of the message. Almost surreal after what she'd just experienced. She typed a quick reply, her fingers still trembling. I'm fine. Love you too. She sat there for several minutes, her back against the door, trying to convince herself she was safe. The house was quiet, familiar, every creak and groan of the old wood comforting in its normalcy. But as her breathing steadied, something felt off. The living room was darker than usual. She glanced at the overhead light, but it was off. She had the overhead light, but it was off. She had left it on that morning. Her eyes flicked to the curtains, which hung half-closed over the window. She could have sworn she had drawn them. Fully shut before leaving for work, a cold realization crept over her. Slowly, she got to her feet, her bare toes curling against the wooden floor. Her gaze darted around the room, scanning for anything out of place. The shadows seemed deeper, the corners darker. She told herself it was her imagination, a lingering effect of the fear still gripping her. But then she heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound. A creak coming from upstairs. Her blood ran cold. She froze, her eyes snapping toward the staircase. The house had always made noises, but this was different. Was deliberate. Her phone was still in her hand. She opened the keypad and dialed 911, her thumb hovering over the call button, but she hesitated. What would she even say? That she'd heard a noise? That someone might be in the house? The operator would ask if she'd seen anything, and she hadn't. Not here, at least. The sound came again, louder this time. Another creak, followed by the faintest hint of movement. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her legs screamed at her throat, her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Her phone slipped from her hand, landing on the floor with a soft thud. She flinched at the sound, her eyes darting back to the staircase. The silence returned, thick and oppressive. Slowly, she crept toward the hallway, her back pressed to the wall. Her eyes remained fixed on the top of the stairs, watching for any sign of movement. Her hands brushed against the hall closet door, and she felt for the wooden baseball bat her dad had kept there since she was a kid. Her fingers closed around the handle, the weight of it grounding her. "Who's there?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. It sounded ridiculous even to her own ears. No response came, but the tension in the air grew heavier, almost palpable. She took a step toward the staircase, gripping the bat tightly. Her knuckles were white, her breathing shallow. She listened for anything, a breath, a shuffle, anything that would confirm her worst fear. But the house was silent, and then she saw it. At the top of the stairs, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure. It was motionless, its face obscured by shadow, but Emily knew it was the same presence that had followed her. She could feel it, cold and malevolent, radiating from the figure like an invisible fog. The figure tilted its head slightly, the motion unnervingly slow, almost curious. Emily's grip on the bat tightened as she took a step back. The figure didn't move. "Get out," she said, her voice shaking. "I'll call the police." The figure took a single step forward, the sound of its footfall echoing through the silent house. Emily's pulse raced as she backed into the living room. Her phone was still on the floor, too far to reach without taking her eyes off the intruder. Her heel caught on the edge of the intruder rug, and she stumbled, falling to the floor. The figure descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, its shadow stretching across the walls. Emily scrambled backward, her hands searching for anything she could use. The bat was still anything she could use. The bat was still in her grip, but she couldn't find the strength to swing it. Her body felt frozen, paralyzed by the figure's presence. As it reached the bottom of the stairs, it stopped for a moment. The two of them were motionless. The silence between them were motionless. The silence between them unbearable. And then, without warning, the figure lunged. Emily swung the bat blindly, the air whooshing as the figure lunged toward her. The weight of it crashed into her, sending her sprawling onto the floor. The bat slipped from her grip, clattering across the hardwood, her vision blurred with panic. But she could feel it cold, oppressive, and impossibly strong, pinning her down. She screamed, kicking and thrashing, but the figure was silent, its grip tightening on her arms. It didn't speak, didn't growl. It was as if the darkness itself had taken form and was pressing its will onto her. Emily's mind raced as she clawed at its face, her nails catching on something rough, almost fabric-like. A mask! Her fingers tore at it desperately, and for a split second she felt the material give way. The figure recoiled, letting out a low guttural sound that wasn't quite human. It staggered back, and Emily scrambled away, her hands fumbling for the bat. She fumbling for the bat, grabbed it and swung wildly, connecting with something solid. The figure grunted and fell backward, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. Emily didn't wait to see if it was getting back up. She bolted for the door, flinging it open and stumbling out into the cold night air. Her bare feet slapped against the pavement as she ran down the street, her lungs burning with every breath. The houses around her were dark, the neighbors oblivious to the nightmare unfolding just yards away. She reached the diner 2 blocks away, its neon sign casting a faint red glow onto the empty street. The door was locked. She pounded on it with both fists, screaming for help. "Open up! Please, somebody!" The sound of her voice echoed in the still night, but no one answered. She turned, her back pressed against the glass, her eyes scanning the street for any sign of the figure. It was gone. The only movement came from the faint flicker of the street lights. Emily slid down to the ground, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. She clutched the bat tightly, her knuckles white, her mind racing. What was that thing? Why had it followed her? And most terrifying of all, what would it do next? She didn't have to wait long for an answer. A faint scraping sound reached her ears, coming from the alley beside the diner. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound grew louder, deliberate, as if something was being dragged across the ground. Emily tightened her grip on the bat, her eyes locked on the mouth of the alley. The figure emerged slowly, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It stood taller now, its movements more deliberate, as if it had been toying with her before. The torn mask dangled loosely from its face, revealing a glimpse of pale skin and hollow, black eyes that seemed to absorb the light around them. Emily's body screamed at her to run, but she was done running. This thing, when it had chased her, invaded her home, and now it was here. As if it had all been some sick game. If it wanted her, it would have to fight for her. She stood, raising the bat, her legs trembling but steady. "Stay back," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "Stay back," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I'm not afraid of you." The figure tilted its head again, that same unnerving motion that made her stomach churn, and then it moved fast, impossibly fast, closing the distance between them. In seconds, Emily swung the bat with all her strength, but it caught the weapon mid-swing, yanking it from her hands with an almost casual ease. Panic surged through her as she stumbled backward, her hands scrambling for anything to defend herself. Her fingers found a loose piece of concrete on the ground, and she hurled it at the figure, striking it square in the chest. It barely flinched. Emily's mind raced. This thing wasn't human. It couldn't be. But what was it? And why was it after her? The figure stepped closer, its heavy footsteps echoing against the pavement. Emily's back hit the diner's glass door, and she realized she had nowhere left to go. Her breath hitched as the figure raised a hand, its fingers impossibly long and claw-like, reaching for her throat. And then the lights flickered. The neon sign above the diner buzzed loudly, its red glow intensifying for a brief moment before plunging the street into darkness. Emily felt the air shift. Heavy and Carlson Wixidoi indirect out the corpse to lie. Astag. Trist. Heavy and shift. Heavy and suffocating. As if the entire world had been swallowed by the void. When the lights came back on, the figure was gone. Emily collapsed to the ground, tears streaming down her face as she gasped for air. Her trembling hands fumbled for her phone, and she finally managed to dial 911. The operator's voice crackled through the speaker, calm and detached. 911, what's your emergency? There's something chasing me, Emily stammered, her words spilling out in a panicked rush. It was in my house, and then it followed me here. You have to send someone. Please. Calm down, Mom, the operator said. Where are you now? The diner on Main Street, Emily said, her voice cracking. Please hurry. We're dispatching an officer to your location, the operator assured her. Stay on the line, Emily nodded, clutching the phone to her chest as she scanned the empty beat. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching her, waiting for its next move. The sound of sirens in the distance brought a flicker of hope, but it was fleeting, because deep down, Emily knew this wasn't over. Emily remained slumped against the diner's door, her breathing shallow and ragged as the wailing sirens grew louder. The faint flicker of blue and red lights lit up the empty street, painting the buildings in an eerie glow. A police cruiser screeched to a halt in front of her, and Officer Daniels stepped out, his face a mask of concern. Emily, are you hurt? He called, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. Emily forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. It was here, she stammered, pointing toward the alley. Something was chasing me. It was in my house. And then, it was right here. Daniels frowned, his hand instinctively moving to the holster on his hip. He glanced toward the alleyway, his beam of light revealing nothing but scattered trash and the faint glint of broken glass. What do you mean by something? Was it a person? Emily shook her head, her eyes darting nervously between the shadows. It wasn't. He was tall and fast, and its face. Her voice trailed off, the memory of those hollow, black eyes sending a shiver down her spine. Daniels didn't look convinced, but he nodded, trying to keep her calm. All right, let's check it out. Stay behind me. Emily hesitated, but followed as Daniels led her toward the alley. His flashlight swept over every corner, illuminating nothing but dirt, wet pavement, and piles of discarded boxes. The air was still heavy and oppressive, as if the entire town was holding its breath. See? Nothing here, Daniels said, turning back to her. Maybe you were just spooked. It's late. And the words died in his throat as a sudden noise echoed through the alley. A sharp, metallic scrape that sent a jolt of terror through Emily. Metallic scrape that sent a jolt of terror through Emily. She grabbed Daniel's arm, her nails digging into his uniform. Do you hear that? She whispered. Daniels nodded, his expression darkening. Stay close. The sound came again, louder this time, like nails dragging across metal. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, reverberating off the brick walls. Daniels tightened his grip on his flashlight, drawing his gun as he moved cautiously forward. Police! If someone's there, come out with your hands up. His voice was steady, commanding, but there was an edge of unease beneath the surface. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily's heart pounded in her ears as she pressed herself against the wall, her eyes darting nervously. Daniel stepped deeper into the alley, his flashlight sweeping over the darkened corners. And then it came. A shadow moved at the edge of the light. Too fast to follow, Daniels turned, his gun raised, but it was too late. The figure emerged from the darkness, its form impossibly tall, its movements fluid and inhuman. Emily screamed as it lunged at Daniels, slamming him against the wall with a sickening crack. Daniels' flashlight clattered to the ground, spinning wildly as the light danced across the alley. Emily froze, her body paralyzed with fear as the figure loomed over Daniels, its hollow eyes fixed on her now. The officer struggled weakly, but the figure's grip was unyielding, its claw-like hands pinning him effortlessly. "Run," Daniels choked out, his voice barely a whisper. Emily didn't need to be told twice. She turned and sprinted back toward the street, her legs moving on pure adrenaline. Behind her she heard a guttural, unnatural growl, followed by a wet, tearing sound that made her stomach turn. She didn't look back. The street was empty when she emerged, the police cruiser still parked with its lights flashing. She yanked the door open and climbed inside, slamming it shut behind her. Her hands fumbled for the radio, her breath coming in panicked gasps. "This is Officer Daniels' car," she screamed into the receiver. "Something's attacking him. Send backup, please." Static crackled in response, followed by a garbled voice. "Stay in the vehicle. Units are en route." Emily dropped the receiver and locked the doors, her fingers trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. Her eyes scanned the street, every shadow a potential threat. She could still hear the faint sounds of struggle coming from the alley, but she didn't dare move. Minutes felt like hours as she waited, her body tense and ready to bolt at the first sign of movement. Finally, the sound of approaching sirens broke the silence. 2 more police cruisers arrived, their lights cutting through the gloom as officers spilled out, guns drawn. Emily stumbled out of the car, her legs weak. "It's in the alley," she gasped. "Got Officer Daniels. Please, you have to." Before she could finish, a deafening roar echoed through the street. The officers turned toward the alley, their flashlights converging on the darkness. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the figure emerged. It moved like a shadow come to life, its form shifting and twisting in the light. The officers shouted commands, their voices overlapping in chaos, but the figure didn't stop. It lunged forward, faster than any of them could react. Gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks echoing through the night. Emily covered her ears, dropping to the ground as the officers fired round after round. But the figure didn't falter. Bullets tore through it, but it seemed unfazed, as though it wasn't bound by the same rules of flesh and blood. One by one, the officers fell, their screams piercing the night as the figure tore through them with inhuman precision. Emily crawled back toward the cruiser, her vision blurred by 2 tears. She reached for the radio again, but her hand froze when she saw it. The figure was standing in the middle of the street, surrounded by the fallen officers. Its hollow eyes met hers, and for a moment it didn't move. It just stared, its gaze heavy and unyielding. Then, slowly, it tilted its head, as if mocking her, and with that, it turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Emily sat frozen, her body trembling. The street was. Her body trembling. The street wasn't littered with bodies, the flashing lights casting an eerie glow on the carnage. She didn't know how long she sat there, staring at the emptiness where the figure had vanished. All she knew was that it wasn't over, not even close. Emily's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel of the police cruiser. Her mind raced, but every thought led to the same horrifying realization. She was completely alone. The figure, whatever it was, had disappeared into the shadows, but its presence lingered, heavy and oppressive. The flickering red and blue lights cast the empty street in eerie, shifting hues, illuminating the carnage left behind. She couldn't stay here. She knew that much. The figure could return at any moment, and she would return at any moment. And she wouldn't survive if it did. Forcing herself to focus, Emily turned the key already in the ignition. The cruiser roared to life, the engine sound breaking the suffocating silence. Her fingers fumbled with the gear shift, her eyes darting toward the alley. It was empty, but the darkness there seemed alive, watching with a shaky breath. She put the car into drive and floored the gas pedal. The tires screeched against the pavement as the cruiser sped down Main Street. She had no warning. 9th Street, destination in mind, just away. Away from the diner, away from the bodies, and away from whatever monstrosity had torn through the night. As the town blurred past her, her mind replayed the events over and over. The figure's hollow eyes, its hollow eyes, impossible speed, the way it seemed impervious to bullets. None of it made sense. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The cruiser's radio crackled, pulling her from her thoughts. A garbled voice came through, distorted but urgent. Unit 27. Report. Officer down. Possible. Hostile. Backup en route. Emily grabbed the microphone, her knuckles white as she pressed the button. This is Emily Sullivan, she said, her voice trembling. I'm in Officer Daniels's cruiser. He's gone. Everyone's gone. It's not human. The radio cut to static, then went dead. Emily stared at it, her pulse quickening. The cruiser's dashboard lights flickered, and the engine let out a sputtering groan. No, she muttered, slamming her palm against the steering wheel. The car shuddered, its speed dropping as the engine struggled to stay alive. She glanced at the gas gauge. It was full. Whatever was happening, it wasn't mechanical. The headlights dimmed, and Emily's stomach sank. The darkness ahead seemed to swell, closing in on her like a living thing. The cruiser coasted to a stop, the engine cutting out completely. Emily sat frozen, her breath shallow as the silence enveloped her once more. She reached for her phone, but the screen wouldn't turn on. It was dead, too. Panic set in as she looked around, the shadows outside the car growing thicker, almost tangible. She locked the doors, her hands trembling as she scanned the street for any sign of movement. Then she heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the roof of the car, slow and deliberate, like the ticking of a clock. Emily's chest tightened as her eyes darted upward, her body frozen in place. The tapping grew louder, heavier, until it became a rhythmic thudding. Whatever was on the roof was massive. Tears streamed down her face as she gripped the bat still lying in the passenger seat. Her fingers closed around the handle, her knuckles white. She couldn't just sit here. She had to do something. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, Emily threw open the driver's side door and bolted. The cold night air bit at her skin as she sprinted down the street. Her bare feet slapping against the pavement. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could hear it following her. The sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed behind her, each one sending a jolt of terror through her body. The figure was toying with her, keeping its distance but letting her know it was there. Emily's legs burned as she pushed herself harder, her lungs screaming for air. She turned onto a side street, her eyes scanning for anything resembling shelter. Ahead, she saw the faint outline of an old church, its steeple rising against the dark sky. The building was abandoned, its windows boarded up, but it was her only option. Emily threw herself at the heavy wooden doors, her shoulder slamming against it and the weathered wood. The door creaked but didn't budge. She pounded on it with both fists, her voice hoarse as she screamed, "Please, let me in!" The footsteps grew louder, closer. Emily turned, her back pressed against the door as the figure emerged from the shadows. It stood at the edge of the street, its hollow eyes fixed on her. For a moment, it didn't move. Then, slowly, it didn't move, raised one long, claw-like hand and pointed at her. Emily's breath hitched as the door behind her suddenly gave way. She stumbled backward into the dark interior, the door slamming shut behind her. She turned, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the boarded windows. The church was silent, its pews covered in a thick layer of dust. Cobwebs hung from the rafters, and the air was heavy with the scent of decay. Emily pressed her back against the door, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. A faint sound echoed through the building, a low, guttural growl. Emily's blood ran cold as she realized she wasn't alone. She tightened her grip on the bat, her eyes scanning the shadows. The growl grew louder, reverberating through the empty space. Emily took a step forward, her body trembling as she followed the sound. In the center of the church, beneath the broken remains of the altar, something moved. At first, it was just a shadow, shifting and writhing in the dim light. But as Emily stepped closer, the shadow took form. It wasn't the figure from the street. This was something else, something worse. A pair of glowing red eyes appeared, staring at her from the darkness. The growl deepened, and the shadow rose, its form stretching unnaturally as it filled the space. Emily stumbled backward, her heart racing as the creature stepped into the light. It was massive, its body covered in jagged, spiked armor that shimmered like oil. Its claws scraped against the floor, leaving deep gouges in the wood. The air around it seemed to vibrate, thick with an energy that made it hard to breathe. Emily raised the bat, her hands shaking. "Stay back," she whispered, though she knew it was useless. The creature tilted its head, a low, rumbling laugh escaping its throat. It took a step toward her, its claws clicking against the floor. Emily gritted her teeth, her fear giving way to a surge of defiance. "If you want me," she said, her voice trembling but steady, "you'll have to fight me." The creature lunged. Emily swung the bat with everything she had, the weight of her fear, turning into raw desperation. The creature moved of her fear turning into raw desperation. The creature moved with unnatural speed, dodging her first swing effortlessly. Its massive claws lashed out, grazing her arm and sending her stumbling back into a row of broken pews. The splintered wood cracked beneath her, and the bat fell from her grasp, rolling just out of reach. The creature let out a guttural laugh, its glowing red eyes fixed on her. It towered over her, the flickering light from the broken windows casting jagged shadows across its armor-like skin. Emily scrambled backward, her hands slipping on the dusty floor as she tried to put distance between herself and the monstrous figure. "Get away!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the hollow church. Her hand brushed against a shard of broken glass from a nearby window, and she grabbed it instinctively, clutching it tightly, despite the sharp edge cutting into her palm. The creature lunged again, its claws outstretched. Emily slashed at it wildly with the glass, the sharp edge catching its arm. To her shock, the creature let out a roar of pain, its black, oily blood dripping onto the floor. It recoiled, its red eyes, its narrowing as if assessing her newfound courage. For a moment, they stared at each other. Emily's chest heaved as adrenaline coursed through her, the glass shard trembling in her grip. The creature tilted its head, almost as if intrigued. Then it stepped back, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had emerged. Emily didn't move, her body frozen in place. The silence that followed was deafening. broken only by her ragged breathing. She gripped the glass tighter, her bleeding hand trembling as she scanned the darkened church. The creature was gone, but she knew better than to believe it had left entirely. Her eyes darted toward the bat, lying just a few feet away. She crawled toward it, her movements slow and deliberate, her ears straining for any sound. She reached out, her fingers brushing the wooden handle, when a sudden noise stopped her cold. A low, rumbling growl echoed through the church, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Emily froze, her hand hovering over the bat as her eyes darted around the room. The shadows seemed to shift and ripple, the air growing heavier with each passing second. Emily. The voice was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't the creature's voice, it was human. Familiar. She turned her head slowly, her eyes widening as she saw a figure standing in the doorway of the church. It was Officer Daniels, but something was wrong. His uniform was torn and bloodied, his face pale and lifeless. His eyes, once warm and kind, were now empty, glowing faintly with the same red hue as the creature's. He took a step forward, his movements stiff and unnatural. "Emily," he said, again his voice hollow, "you shouldn't come here." Her grip on the bat tightened as she pushed herself to her feet. "You're not real," she said, her voice shaking. "You're dead. I saw it." Daniels tilted his head, a twisted smile fretting across his face. "Dead? No, Emily, I'm right here. Just like you will be, soon." Before she could respond, Daniels lunged at her, his movements faster than anything human. Emily swung the bat, the force of the impact sending him crashing into the pews. But he didn't stay down. He rose again, his head jerking unnaturally as he turned to face her. "You can't fight it," he said, his voice low and menacing. "It's already inside you." Emily's stomach turned at his words. She backed away, the bat raised defensively as Daniels stepped closer. The air around him seemed to shimmer, distorting the space between them. She glanced at the broken windows, calculating her chances of escape, but the thought of leaving the church and facing whatever was outside froze her in place. Daniels lunged again, his clawed hands reaching for her throat. Emily ducked, the bat slipping from her hands as she fell to the ground. She kicked out with all her strength, her foot connecting with his chest and sending him sprawling back. Before she could recover, a sudden force knocked her sideways. She rolled across the floor, her head hitting the edge of the altar. Pain shot through her skull, and her vision blurred as she tried to tide at Cointer. Focus! The creature was back. It loomed over her, its claws dripping with the same black, oily blood as before. Daniels was gone, his form replaced by the massive, shadowy figure that now blocked her path. Emily scrambled backward, her hands scrambled backward, searching for anything to defend herself. Her fingers closed around the shard of glass once more, and she held it up like a lifeline. "Stay back!" she screamed, her voice hoarse and desperate. The creature paused, its head tilting as if considering her words. Then, to her surprise, it stepped back. The shadows around it rippled, and its glowing red eyes dimmed slightly. Emily didn't understand what was happening, but she wasn't about to let her guard down. The creature pointed toward the altar, its clawed finger hovering over a symbol carved into the stone. The symbol glowed faintly, pulsating in time with the sound of her racing heartbeat. Emily's brow furrowed as she stared at the symbol. It was familiar, though she couldn't place where she had seen it before. The creature growled softly, its eyes narrowing as it gestured toward the altar again. She whispered, her voice barely audible. The creature didn't respond. It simply waited, its towering form still and silent. Emily's grip on the glass shard loosened as she stepped closer to the altar, her eyes fixed on the glowing symbol. The light seemed to pull her in, filling her mind with fragmented images and memories she didn't recognize. The creature's growl deepened, snapping her out of the trance. She looked up, her fear replaced by a growing sense of unease. Whatever this thing was, it wanted something from her, and she wasn't sure if she had a choice. Emily's trembling hand reached toward the glowing symbol etched into the altar. The faint pulsations of light seemed alive, beating like a heartbeat in the suffocating silence of the church. The creature loomed nearby, its hulking shadow twisting unnaturally against the cracked walls. But it didn't attack. It watched, waiting. Its red eyes dimmed slightly, as if urging her forward. "What are ours? You?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding in her ears. Her fingers hovered over the symbol, a strange warmth emanating from the carved stone. The second she made contact, a searing pain shot through her arm, and she yanked her arm. Hand back with a scream. The glow intensified, flooding the church with an otherworldly light. Emily stumbled backward, shielding her eyes as the symbol burned brighter, its once faint pulses now a blinding strobe. The creature let out a guttural roar, its claws scraping against the wooden floor as it recoiled from the light. Then came the sound, a deep, resonating hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It vibrated through the air, the walls, and up Emily's very bones. The symbol on the altar began to shift, its edges bleeding into the stone like liquid fire, forming new patterns. The air grew heavier, crackling with unseen energy, and Emily felt a strange pull in her chest, a connection she couldn't explain. The creature roared again, louder this time. The sound filled with rage and fear. Emily's eyes adjusted to the light, and she saw the creature writhe in pain, its massive form retreating toward the shadows. The once impenetrable monster seemed smaller now, its movements frantic and uncoordinated, as if the light was tearing it apart. "You're scared of this," Emily murmured, the realization hitting her like a bolt of lightning. Whatever power the altar held, it was something the creature couldn't withstand. She stepped closer, her fear replaced by a desperate determination. "What is this place?" she demanded, her voice rising as she stood before the glowing altar. "Why are you here? Why me?" The creature didn't answer. It couldn't. Its shadowy form flickered like a dying flame, its red eyes narrowing as it hissed, a sound that reverberated with pure malice. Emily braced herself, expecting it to lunge, but instead it sank into the floor, dissolving into the darkness like ink spreading through water. The light dimmed slightly, the room falling silent once more. Emily's breathing was ragged, her mind spinning with unanswered questions. She turned back to the altar, the symbol now steady and calm, its glow casting faint shadows across the dusty floor. Her hand instinctively moved to touch it again, but she stopped herself, the memory of the searing pain still fresh. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for anything that might explain what had just happened. The pews, the broken windows, the faint smell of decay, none of it offered any answers. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that the altar was central to everything. The creature, the feelings, the eerie pull she felt in her chest, it all led back to this place. The faint hum of the symbol still lingered in the air, and Emily stepped closer, her hand hovering over the glowing carving. She didn't touch it this time. Instead, she whispered, "What are you?" The air grew colder, the light dimming slightly, and for a moment Emily thought the altar wouldn't respond. But then, deep within her mind, she heard a voice, not the creature's, but something ancient and cold, like the whisper of the wind through a long-forgotten tomb. "The balance has been broken?" Emily froze, her heart hammering in her chest. What balance? What are you talking about? The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, images flooded her mind, fragmented, blurry, like memories that didn't belong to her. A vast forest, dark and endless. A group of figures standing before the altar, their faces obscured. And then, the creature, its form even more monstrous than she had seen, surrounded by fire and chaos. The images vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Emily gasping for air. She staggered back from the altar, her legs weak beneath her. The weight of the voice's words hung heavy in her mind. The balance, the altar, the creature, it was all connected. But how? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, a creak, like a door opening. Emily spun around, clutching the bat tightly, her eyes scanning the dimly lit church. The front door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. She took a step forward, her muscles tense and ready to spring at any moment. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The silence that followed was deafening. Emily took another step, her grip on the bat tightening as she approached the door. Faint glow of moonlight spilled through the crack, illuminating the dusty floorboards. She pushed the door open, fully, the hinges groaning in protest. The night outside was unnervingly still. The street was empty, the shadows long and deep beneath the faint glow of the streetlights. The air was cold, biting against her skin. As she stepped onto the cracked stone steps of the church, she scanned the darkness, every instinct screaming at her to stay inside, to stay near the altar's strange power. But something compelled her forward. A faint sound reached her ears, barely audible over the pounding of her heart. It was a whisper, carried on the wind, low and guttural. Her eyes darted toward the source, a figure standing at the edge of the street, its form cloaked in shadow. It wasn't the creature. It was human, or at least, looked human. The figure stood motionless, its head tilted slightly as if studying her. Emily's grip on the bat tightened as she took a cautious step forward. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What do you want?" "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward the forest at the edge of town. Emily's stomach churned as she followed its gesture, her eyes landing on the dark silhouette of the trees. The forest had always been a place of unease for Blackwood, filled with old legends and whispered warnings. She had never dared venture into it at night. The figure lowered its hand and took a step back, melting into the shadows. Emily's heart raced as she stared at the empty space where it had stood. She knew what it wanted, the forest, and despite every instinct telling her to turn back, she knew she had no choice. Emily stood at the church's entrance, her gaze fixed on the dark expanse of the forest. The trees fixed on the dark expanse of the forest loomed like towering sentinels, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to beckon her forward. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to lock herself back inside the church and wait for daylight. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever this was, this force, this creature, it wouldn't stop. And now, it wanted her to follow. She gripped the bat tightly, her knuckles white as she descended the cracked stone steps. Cold air nipped at her skin, and the silence was so profound it pressed against her ears like a living thing. Her steps were slow and deliberate, each one carrying her closer to the forest's edge. The soft crunch of gravel beneath her feet was the only sound, and even that felt out of place. In the oppressive quiet, the moment she crossed into the forest, the temperature seemed to drop further. The air was thick, heavy, as though she had stepped into another world. The trees grew denser, their branches clawing at the sky, blocking out what little moonlight remained. Shadows danced in the corners of her vision, shifting with every step she took. The whispering started again. At first, it was faint, just a murmur carried by the wind. But as she ventured deeper, the whispers grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from all around her. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, taunting, as if the forest itself was alive and watching her. Emily's breath was alive and watching her, quickened. She clutched the bat tighter, her eyes darting around the darkened woods. "I know you're there," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm not afraid of you." The forest responded with silence, the whispers fading into the silence, the whispers fading into the sea. Stillness. For a moment, she thought she might be alone. Then, she saw it, a faint glow in the distance, flickering like firelight. Her pulse quickened as she moved toward the light, her footsteps careful and measured. The glow grew brighter with each step, illuminating the gnarled trees and casting long shadows on the forest floor. When she reached the source, she stopped, her breath catching in her throat. It was a clearing, and at its center stood another altar, one in the church but larger, more ancient. The stone was cracked and weathered, its surface covered in glowing runes that pulsed with an eerie red light. Surrounding the altar were figures, 6 of them draped in tattered black robes. Their faces were obscured, but their hands were raised, and their voices joined in a low, guttural chant that seemed to vibrate through the air. Emily crouched behind a tree, her heart pounding as she watched the ritual unfold. The figures swayed in unison, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were part of some terrible, otherworldly dance. The glow from the altar intensified, and the air grew heavier, thick with an energy that made her skin crawl. She wanted to run, to leave this place and never look back, but something held her there, a strange pull that kept her rooted to the spot. The whispers returned, louder now, and this time she could understand them. The balance must be restored. Emily's breath hitched. The words echoed in her mind, the same ones she had heard at the church. She turned her attention back to the altar, her eyes narrowing as she studied the glowing runes. They were different from the ones in the church, sharper, more angular, and radiating a malevolent energy. The chanting reached a fever pitch, the voices rising as the figures began to circle the altar. The light pulsed faster, casting jagged shadows across the clearing. Emily's stomach churned as the air around her seemed to ripple, distorting the edges of her vision. Then she saw it. Emerging from the altar's light was the creature, its form even more massive and grotesque than before. Its red eyes burned like coals, and its black armored skin glistened in the unnatural glow. The robed figures dropped to their knees, their chants becoming frantic pleas as they raised their hands toward the creature. Emily's blood turned to ice. The creature was no longer hunting her. The creature was no longer hunting her, and her grip on the bat tightened as she took a step back, her mind racing. She had to do something. If the creature fully emerged, she knew it wouldn't stop with her. It would consume everything. The whispers grew louder, urgent now. The whispers grew louder, urgent now. The balance must be restored. End it. Emily's gaze darted back to the altar, the glowing runes burning into her vision. She didn't know what would happen if she interfered, but she couldn't just stand by. Taking a deep breath, she stepped up into the clearing. The chanting stopped instantly. The robed figures turned toward her, their movements unnervingly synchronized. Their faces were hidden, but Emily could feel their eyes on her, sharp and unrelenting. The creature let out a low growl, its red eyes locking onto her. It didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, filling the clearing with a suffocating sense of dread. Emily raised the bat, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "I don't know what you are, but I'm not going to let you win." The robed figures rose to their feet, their hands outstretched as they began to move toward her. Emily didn't wait. She charged toward the altar, the bat raised high. The creature roared. Its creature roared. Its The creature roared, its massive form lurching forward, But she didn't stop. With all her strength, she brought the bat down on the altar. The impact sent a shockwave through the clearing, the glowing runes shattering like glass. The red light erupted into a blinding flash, and Emily was thrown backward, the force knocking the wind out of her. She hit the ground hard, her vision swimming as the world around her dissolved into chaos. The creature let out an ear-piercing screech, its form writhing as the altar's destruction tore through it. The robed figures collapsed, their bodies crumbling into ash as the light consumed them. The forest trembled, the trees bending and twisting as if in agony. Emily lay on the ground, her ears ringing and her ears ringing and her ears, body aching. She forced herself to sit up, her eyes widening as she saw the creature begin to dissolve. Its form flickered, its once imposing presence shrinking into nothingness. With one final roar, it vanished, leaving only silence in its tide. Wait, the clearing was empty now. The altar reduced to a pile of rubble. The air was still, the oppressive energy gone. Emily sat there, her chest heaving as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. The balance had been restored, or so she thought. Emily sat in the clearing, her body trembling as the weight of everything she'd endured pressed down on her. The silence in the forest was overwhelming, almost deafening after the chaos that had just unfolded. She stared at the chaos that had just unfolded, shattered remains of the altar, the glowing runes now completely extinguished. For a moment, she dared to hope it was over. But the forest didn't feel right. The air was still heavy, thick with an energy that seemed to linger, even though thick with an energy that seemed to linger, even though the creature and the robed figures were gone. The trees around her swayed gently, but there was no wind. Shadows twisted unnaturally in the corners of her vision, and the faint whispers returned softer now, but still there, like an echo of Fafhrn now, but still there, like an echo of something far away. Emily forced herself to stand, her legs weak and unsteady. She clutched the bat, her knuckles white as she turned in a slow circle, scanning the tree line. "What now?" she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. The whispers grew louder, forming words that sent a chill down her spine. "It is not finished." Emily froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "What do you mean?" she said aloud, her voice shaking. "I destroyed it. It's gone." The forest seemed to shudder in response, the ground beneath her feet trembling slightly. The whispers became clearer, more distinct, though they didn't come from a single direction. The balance was broken and cannot be restored. Panic surged through her. "I did what you wanted. I stopped it. What else am I supposed to do?" The whispers didn't answer. Instead, the ground beneath the ruined altar began to shift. The rubble trembled, pieces of stone levitating slightly before falling back to the earth. Emily stepped back, her grip on the bat tightening as the movement grew more violent. Cracks spread outward from the altar's base, dark and jagged, like veins crawling across the forest floor. A low, guttural sound emerged from the earth, deep and resonant. Unlike anything Emily had ever heard, wasn't the creature's roar. This was something older, more primal, and infinitely more terrifying. The cracks widened, and a faint red glow seeped out, casting an eerie light across the clearing. "No," Emily whispered, shaking her head. "This can't be happening." The ground beneath the altar collapsed, revealing a dark chasm that seemed to stretch endlessly downward. From its depths came the glow pulsing, alive, and the unmistakable sense of something rising. Emily stumbled back, her breathing ragged as she watched the chasm widen. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices that filled her mind. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block them out, but it was useless. The voices weren't coming from the forest. They were coming from within her. "You have awakened it?" Her knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, the bat slipping from her grasp. The glow intensified, and she could feel the heat radiating from the chasm. She looked up, tears streaming down her face as the truth hit her like a punch to the gut. The creature wasn't the source. It was only the beginning. Something else was coming. Something far worse. The whispers coalesced into a single, deafening voice. You cannot run. You cannot hide. The balance is shattered, and it will consume everything, Emily screamed, the sound tearing from her throat as the chasm erupted with light. The force of it knocked her backward, and she showed a true non-insurance to it, landed hard on the forest floor, her vision swimming. She tried to get up, but her body wouldn't respond. All she could do was watch as the light poured out of the chasm, illuminating the trees and the sky above. And then she saw it. A shape began to emerge from the glowing abyss, massive and formless, its edges shifting and twisting like smoke. It was impossible to focus on, its very presence defying reality. The air grew heavier, and Emily felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though the forest itself was recoiling from whatever was rising. The shape solidified slowly, taking on the form of a towering figure. Its body wreathed in flickering shadows and crimson light. Its eyes burned brighter than the creature's head, piercing through the darkness and locking onto Emily. She felt its gaze like a physical weight, pressing down on her chest and stealing the air from her lungs. The figure spoke, its voice a rumble that seemed to shake the earth. You should not have interfered. Emily's vision blurred as tears streamed down her face. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. Her body was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer presence of the being before her. The figure took a step forward. The ground trembling beneath its massive form. The glow from the chasm began to fade, but the figure remained, its towering silhouette blotting out the faint moonlight. It reached out a hand, clawed and glowing, toward Emily. Please. She managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean to. The figure's hand stopped inches from her face, the air around it crackling with energy. It tilted its head, studying her with an intensity that made her stomach churn. For a moment, she thought it might kill her then and there, but instead, it spoke again. You will undo what you have done, or you will perish. Before she could respond, the figure dissolved into shadow, its form scattering like smoke in the wind. The chasm's smoke in the wind sealed itself with a deafening crack, and the glow vanished, plunging the forest into darkness once more. Emily lay on the ground, her body trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. The whispers were gone, the oppressive energy lifted, but the weight of the figure's words remained. She knew what she had to do, and she knew she wouldn't survive it. Emily lay motionless in the clearing, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths as the darkness of the forest seemed to wrap around her like a shroud. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the cold wind. The figure's words echoed in her mind. You will undo what you have done, or you will perish. Her trembling fingers searched for the bat she had dropped, finding the familiar wooden handle just within reach. The weight of it felt insignificant now, like a feeble weapon against the monumental force she had unleashed. She staggered to her feet, her legs weak and unsteady, and glanced around the clearing. The altar was gone, replaced by a jagged, scorched scar in the earth. The faint glow of the runes had disappeared, leaving only darkness behind, but something lingered, a presence. It was faint, lingered a presence. It was faint but undeniable, like a shadow at the edge of her vision. The forest wasn't just alive. It was watching. Emily turned toward the direction she had come from, the faint outline of the church spire barely visible through the tangled branches. She wanted to go back, to run as far from this cursed place as possible. But deep down, she knew the church wouldn't protect her now. Nothing would. Not until she found a way to undo what had been set into motion. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and coming from behind her. She froze, gripping the bat tightly as her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned, her eyes scanning the darkness for the source. At first, there was nothing, just the endless shadows of the forest, twisting and shifting in the faint moonlight. Then, a figure emerged from the trees. It wasn't the towering creature or the robed figures she had seen before. This figure was human, or at least, it looked human, or at least, it looked human. A man, dressed in tattered clothes, his face pale and gaunt. He moved with a strange, jerky gait, as though his body didn't fully belong to him. Emily raised the bat, her voice trembling. "Stay back! I don't know who you are, but I'll use this if I have to." The man stopped, his head tilting slightly as he studied her. His eyes were hollow, empty pits that seemed to suck in the light around them. When he spoke, his voice was low and rasping, like dry leaves scraping against stone. "You shouldn't be here." Emily tightened her grip on the bat, taking a cautious step back. "Trust me, I didn't want to be here, but I don't think I have a choice." The man's expression didn't change. He took another step forward, his movements slow but deliberate. "You've woken it," he said, his voice filled with something between anger and sorrow. "Do you even understand what you've done?" Emily's pulse quickened. "No," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't. But I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of it." The man let out a hollow laugh, the sound chilling in its emptiness. "No one ever does, but that doesn't change the price." Emily swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. "What is it? That thing? Why is it after me?" The man's gaze shifted to the scar in the earth, his hollow eyes narrowing. "It's not after you," he said. "It's after everything. The balance that kept it sealed is gone. You broke it, and now it's free." Emily's mind raced, the events of free. Emily's mind raced, the events of for the night playing over and over in her head. "But I destroyed the altar, I thought." "You thought wrong," the man interrupted, his tone sharp. "Destroying the altar didn't stop it. It just unleashed the final lock. Now it's only a matter of time before it consumes everything." Emily's knees buckled, and she leaned against a tree for support. "There has to be a way to stop it," she said, her voice desperate. "You said I could undo it. How?" The man hesitated, his gaze darkening. "There's a way," he said slowly, "but it's not something you'll survive." Emily's heart sank. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the forest floor. "The altar was only one piece of the seal. The other pieces are scattered, hidden in places even worse than this. To fix the balance, you'd have to find them all and restore what was broken." Her stomach turned at the thought. "And if I don't?" The man's hollow eyes locked onto hers. "Then the world dies." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The enormity of the situation pressed down on her, threatening to crush her completely. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but none of that would change what she had to do. She straightened, gripping the bat tightly as she steadied herself. "Tell me where to start." The man studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, his movements slow and deliberate. "There's another altar," he said, "deeper in the forest, but it's guarded. And if you thought the creature you saw tonight was bad, you've seen nothing yet." Emily swallowed hard, the fear clawing at her insides. But she nodded. "I'll find it." The man tilted his head again, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're either brave or foolish. Maybe both." He turned, his form dissolving into the shadows as he spoke one last time. "If you survive, we'll speak again. If you survive, will speak again. Not, well, it won't matter. Emily stood alone in the clearing, the weight of her task pressing down on her. The whispers had returned, softer now, but insistent, urging her forward. She took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness, the forest closing in around her like a living thing. She didn't know what awaited her, but she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Emily tightened her grip on the bat as she trudged deeper into the forest, the whispers growing louder with each step. They weren't words anymore, just sounds, disjointed and chaotic, like fragments of voices tangled in the wind. The darkness pressed against her, and the trees seemed to close in, their twisted branches clawing at us, clawing at us, clawing at us. The sky. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Her feet crunched on the uneven ground, the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the thick canopy above. Every now and then, she thought she saw movement in the shadows, figures darting between the trees, too quick to catch. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she pushed forward, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. What was the seal? Who or what was guarding the next altar? And how was she supposed to fix something so ancient, so beyond her understanding? The air grew colder as she descended into a narrow ravine, the path winding between jagged rocks covered in moss. The whispers faded slightly, replaced by a low rhythmic hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Emily's pulse quickened as she followed the sound, her steps cautious and deliberate. The ravine opened into a small clearing, and at its center stood another altar. This one was different from the first. It was larger, made of dark stone that seemed to absorb the light around it. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, glowing faintly with a pulsating blue light. The hum grew louder as she approached, and the air seemed to vibrate with unseen energy. But the altar wasn't unguarded. A figure stood before it, its back to her. At first glance, it looked human, a man dressed in ragged clothes, his hair long and matted, but something about him was wrong. His movements were too rigid, too precise, as if he were a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Emily froze, her heart pounding as she gripped the bat tighter. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive. The whispers returned, more insistent now, urging her forward. "Who are you?" she called, her voice shaking. The figure turned slowly, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. Its face was pale and gaunt, its hollow eyes glowing faintly with the same blue light as the altar when it spoke. Its voice was distorted, likewise was distorted, like multiple voices speaking at once. "You should not be here." Emily swallowed hard, her grip on the bat tightening. "I don't want to be here," she said, her voice trembling. "But I don't have a choice." The figure took a step toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural. "The balance is broken," it said, "and you are its catalyst." Emily's mind raced. "I didn't mean to break anything," she said. "I just want to fix it." The figure stopped, its hollow eyes narrowing as it studied her. "Fixing it requires sacrifice," it said. "Are you prepared to give everything?" Emily hesitated, her fear warring with her determination. "If it means stopping this, whatever this is, then yes." The figure tilted its head, as if considering her words. Then it raised a hand, and the glow from the altar intensified, casting long shadows across the clearing. The hum grew louder, and the air became thick with energy. "You must prove yourself," the figure said. "Only then will the path reveal itself." Before Emily could respond, the ground beneath her feet began to shake. The altar's glow pulsed rapidly, and the hum grew into a deafening roar. The figure stepped back, disappearing into the shadows as the earth cracked open around the altar. From the chasm emerged something sealed, monstrous. It was massive, its form twisting and shifting like smoke, yet solid enough to tear through the ground with razor-sharp claws. Its eyes burned with the same blue light as the altar, and its maw opened to reveal rows of jagged teeth. It let out a guttural roar, the sound reverberating through the clearing and shaking Emily to her core. Emily stumbled back, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs refused to move. The creature towered over her, its form writhing as if it were made of shadows and fire. It lunged forward, its claws slashing through the air, and Emily barely managed to dodge, the force of its attack knocking her to the ground. She scrambled to her feet, the bat feeling like a toothpick in her feet. Hands! The creature roared again, its glowing eyes fixed on her as it charged. Emily swung the bat with all her strength, the wood connecting with the creature's claw. The impact sent a jolt of pain through her arms, but the creature barely flinched. This isn't going to work, she muttered to herself, panic rising in her chest. The whispers returned, louder now, drowning out the creature's roars. They filled her mind, urging her to focus, to fight. Her eyes darted toward the altar, its glow pulsating in time with the creature's movements. The connection was clear. The altar was the source of the creature's power. But how was she supposed to destroy it? The creature lunged again, and Emily dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its claws. Her eyes locked on the glowing runes carved into the altar's surface, and an idea began to form. She didn't need to destroy the altar, she needed to disrupt it. Emily turned and ran, the creature close on her heels. She grabbed a loose rock from the ground and hurled it at the altar. The rock struck one of the runes, and the glow flickered, the creature letting out an ear-piercing screech as it staggered back. That worked, Emily muttered, her chest heaving as she grabbed another rock. She hurled it with all her strength, striking another rune. The glow dimmed further, and the creature howled in agony, its form flickering like a dying flame. She grabbed the bat, gripping it tightly as she ran toward the altar. The creature roared, its claws slashing wildly as it tried to stop her. But she was faster. With a final swing, she brought the bat down on the largest rune. The wood splintering as the rune shattered. The altar's glow erupted in a blinding flash, and the creature let out one final, deafening roar before dissolving into shadows. The ground beneath the altar cracked open, swallowing it whole, and the clearing fell silent once more. Emily collapsed to the ground, her body trembling as the adrenaline faded. The whispers were gone, and the oppressive energy had lifted, but she knew this was far from over. She had proven herself, and the path had only just begun. Emily sat on the cold, damp ground, her body trembling from the aftermath of the battle. Her fingers clutched the splintered bat, her lifeline in this nightmare, as her mind raced to comprehend what had just happened. The clearing was eerily silent now, the whispers gone, the oppressive energy lifted, but the weight of her task felt heavier than ever. She glanced toward the altar's remnants. The jagged fissure where the chasm had swallowed it was still there, smoldering faintly with an unnatural light. The ground around it was scorched, the trees nearest to it blackened and lifeless. The faint smell of burnt earth lingered in the air, making her stomach churn. Emily forced herself to her feet. Muscle in her body protesting. The forest loomed around her, its darkness even more suffocating now that the altar's light had been extinguished. She wiped the sweat from her brow, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She knew she couldn't stay here. The second altar had been dealt with, but the man's words haunted her. There are others. Her legs felt like lead as she moved toward the edge of the clearing, her eyes darting nervously between the trees. Every rustle of leaves, faint creak of a branch set her heart racing. Whatever she had faced so far, she was certain it wasn't the end. It was only a taste of what was to come. As she stepped into the denser part of the forest, the air grew colder again, and she felt a faint pull and almost magnetic tug in her chest. It was the same sensation that had led her to the previous altars. She gritted her teeth and pressed forward, her grip tightening on the shattered bat. She had no idea where she was going, but something deep inside her knew it was the right direction. The path became more treacherous as the forest thickened. Roots jutted out of the ground like skeletal fingers, threatening to trip her with every step. The trees were closer together with every step now, their twisted branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy overhead. The faint glow of moonlight barely pierced through, leaving her in near total darkness. And then she heard it. A faint rustling sound, just ahead. It was subtle, almost too quiet to notice, but it sent a shiver down her spine. She froze, her eyes straining to see through the shadows. The rustling grew louder, accompanied by the faint crunch of leaves underfoot. Whatever it was moving toward whatever it was. It was moving toward her. Emily's pulse quickened as she raised the bat, her body tense and ready to spring. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling but firm. No response. The rustling stopped, and the silence was deafening. Her grip on the bat tightened as she took a cautious step forward. The forest felt alive, its shadows shifting and writhing around her. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to take another step. That's when she saw it. A pair of glowing yellow eyes emerged from the darkness, piercing through the shadows like twin lanterns. They were low to the ground, unblinking, and fixed directly on her. Emily's breath hitched as the creature stepped into the faint light. It was unlike anything she had seen before. Its body was long and sinuous, covered in sleek black fur that seemed to shimmer in the darkness. Its limbs, to shimmer in the darkness, were unnaturally long, ending in razor-sharp claws that scraped against the ground as it moved. Its mouth was a grotesque snarl, revealing rows of jagged teeth that glistened with saliva. Emily took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes narrowing as it crouched, ready to pounce. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not again." The creature lunged. Emily swung the bat with all her strength. The splintered wood connecting with the creature's side. It let out a high-pitched screech, stumbling to the ground but recovering almost instantly. Before she could swing again, it lashed out with one clawed paw, knocking the bat from her hands and sending her sprawling to the ground. She scrambled backward, her hands clawing at the dirt as the creature advanced. Its glowing eyes burned with fury, and its snarl grew louder as it bared its teeth. Emily's mind raced, searching for anything violent she could use to defend herself. Her hand brushed against a jagged rock, and she grabbed it without hesitation. As the creature lunged again, she drove the rock into its side, aiming for the soft flesh just below its ribs. The creature howled in pain, its body twisting as it thrashed wildly. Emily didn't wait to see if it would recover. She scrambled to her feet and ran, her legs pumping as fast as they could carry her. The forest blurred around her, the branches clawing at her, clothes and skin as she pushed forward. The creature's howls echoed behind her, growing fainter with each step. She didn't stop until she stumbled into another clearing, collapsing to the ground in a heap. Her chest heaved as she gasped for air, her body trembling with exhaustion. The whispers were back, faint but insistent, guiding her toward the center of the clearing. And there it was, the third altar. This one was smaller than the others, its surface smooth and polished like black glass. The runes carved into it glowed faintly, their light pulsing in time with her racing heartbeat. The hum of energy was weaker here, almost imperceptible, but it was still there. Emily staggered to her feet. Her eyes locked on the feet. Her eyes locked on the altar. She didn't know what to expect this time, but she knew she had to act quickly. She grabbed the nearest heavy object, a large branch that had fallen nearby, and approached the altar. The whispers grew louder, their tone urgent and pleading. Emily hesitated, her grip on the branch tightening. She didn't know if she could do this again. Every strike, every shattered rune brought her closer to whatever was waiting at the end of this nightmare. But she didn't have a choice. Taking a choice. Deep breath. She raised the branch high and brought it down with all her strength. The altar shattered instantly, the runes exploding in a burst of light. The ground trembled, and a deafening roar erupted from the forest, shaking the trees and sending a wave of fear crashing over her. Emily fell to her knees, her hands covering her ears as the sound tore through her. When it finally stopped, the forest was silent once more. But she knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Emily knelt in the clearing, her body trembling as the forest fell into a deathly silence. The shattered remnants of the third altar glimmered faintly in the moonlight, and the whispering voices were gone. In their place was an ominous stillness that felt even worse. She gripped the broken branch tightly, her knuckles white as she scanned the tree line, waiting for the next inevitable terror to emerge. Then she felt it, a low vibration beneath her knees. Faint at first, but growing steadily stronger. The ground trembled as if something massive was stirring deep below. Emily's breath quickened, her heart pounding in her chest. The roar she had heard before still echoed in her mind, a sound of pure rage, primal and unrelenting. Vibration intensified, and a crack split the earth just beyond the altar. Emily scrambled backward, the branch slipping from her grasp as she tried to distance herself from whatever was coming. The crack widened, jagged and black, glowing, jagged and black, glowing faintly with an unnatural red light. And then it rose. The ground erupted, sending dirt and debris flying as a massive form emerged from the chasm. Emily shielded her face with her arms, her body shaking as the air grew thick with heat and energy. When she looked up, her blood ran cold. The creature was unlike anything she had faced before. Towering over her, its body was a grotesque fusion of flesh and stone, its jagged limbs dripping with molten fire. Its head was crowned with molten fire, massive, curling horns that glowed faintly, and its eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through her. It let out a guttural roar, the sound reverberating through the forest and shaking the trees. Emily stumbled to her feet, her mind racing. She couldn't fight this. The creature was beyond anything she could comprehend, its sheer presence suffocating. But the whispers had been clear. She had to keep going. She had to finish this. The creature's gaze locked. The creature's gaze locked onto her, and it lunged. Emily darted to the side, her feet slipping on the uneven ground as the creature's massive claws tore through the earth where she had just been standing. The force of the attack sent shockwaves rippling through the clearing, knocking her off balance. She hit the ground hard, the air rushing from her lungs, gasping for breath. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting around the clearing for anything she could use as a weapon. The broken branch was too far away, and the altar's shards were scattered and useless. The creature roared again, its molten claws glowing as it stalked toward her. Her mind raced. "Think, Emily, think!" The whispers returned, faint and fragmented, but their message was clear. The light. Use the light. Emily's eyes darted to the glowing fissure in the ground where the creature had emerged. The red light pulsed rhythmically, almost alive. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it was connected to the creature if she could disrupt it. Maybe, just maybe, she could stop this. The creature lunged again, its claws swiping inches from her face as she dove to the side. Her hand scraped against the rough earth, and she grabbed a loose rock, clutching it tightly as she scrambled to her feet. "I hope this works," she muttered, her voice trembling. The creature roared, charging toward her. Emily turned and sprinted toward the fissure, her heart pounding as the heat intensified. The red glow grew brighter, pulsating faster as the creature closed the distance between them. With a desperate cry, she hurled the rock into the fissure. The reaction was instant. The ground shook violently, and a deafening crack echoed through the clearing as the red light flared, blindingly bright. The creature let out a howl of agony, its massive form convulsing as the light engulfed it. Emily threw herself to the ground, shielding her eyes as the heat and light consumed the air around her. When the light faded, the clearing was silent once more. Emily opened her eyes slowly, her vision blurry and her body aching. The creature was gone, its massive form reduced to nothing but a faint scorch mark on the ground. The fissure had closed, leaving the earth cracked and blackened but stable. She sat up, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Her mind raced with questions, but the one that loomed largest was this. How many more are there? The faint pull in her chest returned, and she groaned, knowing what it meant. The next altar was calling her, its energy tugging at her like an invisible thread. She didn't know how much more she could take, but she didn't have a choice. Whatever she had awakened, it wasn't going to stop until she did. Emily pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling as she staggered toward the edge of the clearing. The forest loomed ahead, dark and unyielding, but she pressed on. The whispers were gone, and the oppressive energy had lifted, but the weight of her task pressed heavily on her shoulders. She didn't know how much longer she could fight, but she had to keep going. Because if she didn't, the world would burn. Emily staggered through the forest, each step heavier than the last. Her legs felt like lead, her chest heaved with every breath, and her mind buzzed with the aftermath of the battle. The faint pull in her chest persisted, guiding her deeper in the instead prey. The faint pull in her chest persisted, guiding her deeper into the dark expanse of trees. Though the immediate danger seemed to have passed, the oppressive sense of being watched never left her. The forest was quieter now. Too quiet. The usual rustling of leaves, the chirping of nocturnal creatures, all of it had disappeared. Only the faint sound of her own footsteps and the occasional crack of a twig beneath her boots broke the eerie silence. The whispers had stopped entirely, leaving Emily to face the void of her own thoughts. Her grip tightened on the broken bat she carried like a lifeline. The splintered wood felt useless now, a pathetic weapon against the forces she'd encountered, but she clung to it anyway. It was anything to hold on to. As she moved deeper into the forest, the terrain grew more treacherous. The trees became denser, their twisted roots snaking across the ground like veins. The air grew colder, biting at her exposed skin. The faint pull in her chest led her to a narrow path, barely visible under the canopy of branches. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, but she didn't. She couldn't. Ahead, the faint glow of light filtered through the trees, flickering like firelight. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she approached cautiously, her grip on the bat tightening. She reached the edge of another clearing, her breath catching in her throat. The fourth altar. This one was unlike the others. It was massive, its towering stone structure carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shimmer and shift under the light of a dozen torches. The glow was not red or blue this time, but a sickly green, casting an otherworldly hue over the clearing. The energy radiating from the altar was suffocating. heavier than anything she had felt before. But what made her stomach churn was what surrounded it. Figures. Dozens of them. Some human, others not. The human figures stood motionless, their faces blank and lifeless, their eyes glowing and lifeless, their eyes glowing faintly with the same green light as the altar. The non-human forms were twisted and grotesque, their bodies warped as if they had been molded from clay, and then broken. They moved in slow, jerking motions, circling the altar like moths drawn to a flame. Emily's knees threatened to give out as she crouched behind a tree, trying to steady her breathing. Her mind screamed for her to turn around, to run far from this nightmare, but the pull in her chest was stronger now, almost painful. She knew she had to destroy this altar, just as she had the others. But how? The figures moved in perfect synchronization, their steps precise and deliberate. They didn't speak or make any sound, but their presence was overwhelming. Emily's eyes darted around the clearing, searching for anything she could use to her advantage. The torches flickered in the cold wind, their flames casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. And then she saw it. Near the base of the altar, half buried in the dirt, was a jagged metal rod. It looked ancient, its surface rusted and uneven, but it radiated a faint energy that made her chest tighten. The rod pulsed in time with the altar's glow, as if it were connected. That's it, she thought, her mind racing. If I can get to that rod, I can destroy the altar. The problem was the figures. They formed an almost impenetrable wall around the altar, their movements slow but deliberate. Emily would have to be quick, silent, and precise. She took a deep breath, clutching the bat tightly as she planned her next move. The forest seemed to hold its breath with her, the silence pressing down like a weight. Then she moved. Emily crept through the shadows, her body low to the ground as she weaved between the trees. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat loud enough to make her wince. The figures didn't seem to notice her at first, their glowing eyes fixed on the altar. She inched closer, every step measured and deliberate. When she reached the edge of the clearing, she froze. She froze. The non-human figures turned its head, its twisted neck creaking as its hollow gaze scanned the darkness. Emily held her breath, her body pressed against the trunk of a tree. The figure lingered for a moment before returning to its slow, mechanical movements. Emily exhaled shakily and moved again, her eyes locked on the metal rod. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to vibrate, the energy radiating from the altar almost unbearable. Her hands trembled as she gripped the bat, sweat dripping down her face despite the cold. Finally, she reached the base of the altar. The rod was within arm's reach, its surface glowing faintly with a sickly green light. Emily hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming at her to stop. But she pushed the fear aside and grabbed the rod with both hands. The moment her fingers closed around it, a surge of energy shot through her body, bringing her to her knees. Her vision blurred as the ground seemed to tilt beneath her. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their voices screaming in unison. "You are not worthy!" Emily gritted her teeth, her grip tightening on the rod as she forced herself to stand. Her body felt like it was on fire, her muscles trembling with the effort. She raised the rod high, the whispers growing louder and more frantic. "Not worthy?" she hissed through clenched teeth. "Watch me!" With all her strength, she drove the rod into the altar's base. The impact sent a shockwave through the clearing, the green light flaring blindingly bright. The figures around the altar let out ear-piercing screams, their bodies convulsing as the light consumed them. The altar cracked, its surface splitting open as the energy within erupted, her body slamming into the ground as the sound of shattering stone filled the air. The green light dimmed, fading into nothingness as the altar collapsed into rubble. The clearing fell silent. Emily lay on the ground, her body aching, and her vision blurred. The figures were gone, their forms reduced to ash that scattered in the cold wind. The altar was destroyed, its remnants nothing more than a pile of broken stone. But the pull in her chest didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. Emily forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling as she salved and ended. Her legs trembling as she staggered toward the edge of the clearing. She didn't know how much more she could take, but the path was clear. There was still another altar, and it was waiting for her. Emily stumbled forward, the forest closing in around her as the faint the faint pull in her chest became almost unbearable. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but she couldn't stop. The fourth altar was destroyed, but the weight of her task had only grown heavier. Each step brought her closer to something unknown, something that felt darker and more dangerous than anything she had faced so far. The forest seemed to change as she moved deeper. The trees twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches reaching down like skeletal hands. The air grew colder, and the faint glow of moonlight was swallowed by the thick canopy above. The only light came from the faint, otherworldly glow that seemed to emanate from the path ahead. Pulsing in time with the pull in her chest, she clutched the broken bat tightly, though she knew it was useless. Now, the creatures she had faced, the horrors she had endured, they were growing stronger, and she was running out of strength as she moved deeper into the forest. A sound broke the oppressive silence, the faint murmur of voices. At first she thought it was the whispers again, but these were different. Louder, though a crowd was moving just ahead. She crept forward cautiously, her footsteps silent on the soft earth. The trees opened into another clearing, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. The fifth altar stood at the center, towering and ancient, its surface carved with runes that glowed with a blood-red light. The air around it shimmered, heavy with heat and energy. But it wasn't the altar that froze her in place. It was the people, hundreds of them, standing in a perfect of the warrior's spears. Sarah worldwide the bearish shep circle around the altar. They were dressed in everyday clothes, jeans, jackets, sneakers, but their faces were blank, their eyes glowing with the same red light as the runes. They didn't move, didn't speak, but the hum of their presence filled the air like static electricity. Emily's stomach churned as she scanned the crowd. They were alive. She could see their chests rising and falling with shallow breaths, but they weren't themselves. They were part of the altar, connected to it in a way that made her skin crawl. The whispers returned, faint but insistent, urging her forward. She clenched her fists, her mind racing. How was she supposed to destroy the altar without hurting them? Or was that even possible? Before she could move, the air in the clearing shifted, the hum grew louder, and the crowd parted as something stepped forward. Emily's blood ran cold. It was the man from before, the gaunt figure who had appeared near the second altar, but he was different now. His face was more angular, his features sharper, almost alien. His hollow eyes burned with an intensity that made her chest tighten, and his movements were smooth and deliberate, as though the forest itself bent to his will. "You've come far," he said, his voice low and resonant, carrying across the clearing. "But you are not ready." Emily's grip on the bat tightened. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "What is this? Why are you doing this?" The man tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I am a guardian," he said, "a protector of the balance you so carelessly shattered." "I didn't mean to," Emily said, her voice rising. "I didn't ask for any of this." The man stepped closer, his presence suffocating. Intentions mean nothing now. You set this in motion, and only you can end it. Emily's chest tightened as the pull in her chest grew stronger, almost painful. How? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What do I have to do? The man gestured to the altar. The seals must be restored, the altars destroyed. But to break this one, you must make a choice. The hum grew louder, the red light from the runes intensifying. Emily glanced at the altar. Then a crowd of motionless people surrounding it. Her stomach turned as realization dawned. They're connected, she said, her voice trembling. If I destroy the altar, they will be freed, the man interrupted, his tone sharp, but not in the way you hope. Emily's knees felt weak as the weight of his words sank in. Destroying the altar would stop whatever was coming, but it would also destroy the people tethered to it. She took a step back, her mind racing. There had to be another way. The man watched her, his expression cold. Hesitation will only make it worse, he said. The longer the altar stands, the stronger the corruption grows. If you wait too long, there will be nothing left to save. Emily's hands trembled as she gripped the bat, her knuckles white. The whispers in her mind grew louder, urging her forward, but she couldn't move. She couldn't bring herself to do it. What if I don't? She asked, her voice barely audible. The man's hollow eyes locked onto hers. Then the world ends, the words hung in the air. Heavy and final, Emily swallowed hard, tears streaming down her face as she stepped toward the altar. The crowd didn't move, their glowing eyes fixed on nothing. She raised the bat, her hands shaking. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. The bat came down with all her strength, striking the altar's surface. The runes cracked, the red light flaring blindingly bright as the hum turned into a deafening roar. The crowd let out a collective scream, their bodies convulsing as the light consumed them. Emily fell to her knees, the bat slipping from her grasp as the altar shattered. The ground shook violently, and the red light erupted into the sky, piercing the darkness. When the light faded, the clearing was silent. The people were gone, the altar was gone, and Emily was alone. The pull in her chest didn't fade. It grew, stronger, sharper, as if dragging her towards something final, something inevitable. The end was near, and she wasn't ready. Emily knelt in the clearing, her body trembling as the weight of her actions crushed her. The silence was unbearable, the kind that seeped into her bones and left her feeling hollow. The fifth altar was gone, shattered into jagged pieces scattered across the clearing. The people who had been tethered to it, their blank stares, glowing eyes, and lifeless forms, had vanished as if they had never existed. But the pull in her chest remained, stronger now, more insistent. It tugged at her like an invisible chain, dragging her deeper into the forest. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the very trees were closing in around her. Emily wiped the tears from her face, her hands shaking as she forced herself to stand. She didn't know how much more she could take, but the thought of stopping, of letting this nightmare consume the world, pushed her forward. Her legs felt like lead as she stumbled into the darkness, her broken bat clutched tightly in her hands. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows deeper and more alive. The twisted branches overhead formed a canopy so dense, a canopy so dense that not even the faintest sliver of moonlight could break through. The only illumination came from the faint glow ahead, pulsating in time with the pull in her chest. As she walked, the whispers returned. They were softer now, less frantic. They were softer now, less frantic, but no less unsettling. They spoke in fragments, their words slipping through her mind like water through her fingers. She couldn't understand them, but their tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, as if they knew what awaited her, and feared it as much as she did. The path narrowed, the trees pressing in closer, until Emily had to push her way through the tangled branches. Each step felt like a struggle, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the weight of the forest bore down on her. The pull in her chest grew sharper, almost painful, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic symphony that made her head throb. Then, suddenly, the forest opened up. Emily stepped into a massive clearing, and her breath stepped into a massive clearing, and her breath caught in her throat. The final altar stood at the center, towering above her like a monument to some ancient, forgotten god. It was unlike the others, larger, more intricate, its surface covered in runes that glowed with a blinding white light. The air around it shimmered, charged with an energy so intense it made her skin crawl. But it wasn't the altar that made her blood run cold. It was the creature standing before it. It was the creature standing before it. It was massive, its form twisting and writhing, as if it couldn't decide what shape to take. Its body was a grotesque fusion of shadow and light, its edges flickering like a dying flame. Its eyes burned with a piercing white light, and its presence was suffocating, filling the clearing with an overwhelming sense of dread. Emily froze, her legs refusing to move as the creature turned its gaze toward her. Its eyes locked onto hers, and she felt a wave of cold wash over her, freezing her in place. The whispers in her mind became a deafening roar, their fragmented words blending into a single desperate plea. And the creature stepped forward, its massive claws digging into the earth as it moved. The ground trembled beneath its weight, and the air grew colder with its weight, and the air grew colder with wow. Each step, Emily's grip on the bat tightened, her knuckles white as she forced herself to take a step back. The creature tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing as it studied her. When it spoke, its voice was a deep, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate through her entire body. "You have come far," it said, its tone filled with a strange mix of admiration and malice. "But you are not strong enough." Emily swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't have a choice," she said, her voice trembling. "I have to stop this." The creature let out a low, rumbling laugh. "Stop this," it repeated. "You think you can undo what has already been set in motion. The balance is beyond saving. You should have stayed away." Emily took a step forward, her fear giving way to a surge of defiance. "If it's beyond saving, then why are you still here? Why haven't you destroyed everything yet?" The creature's laughter faded, its glowing eyes narrowing further. "Because I want you to see," it said, "to understand the futility of your actions. You will fail, and the world will burn." Emily clenched her fists, her fear replaced by a burning determination. "Not if I stop you," the creature roared, the sound echoing through the clearing as it lunged toward her. Emily dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its massive claws as they tore through the ground where she had been standing. She scrambled to her feet, the bat feeling small and insignificant in her hands as the creature turned toward her again. The whispers in her mind grew louder, their tone frantic as they urged her toward the altar. Emily's eyes darted to the glowing runes carved into its surface, their light pulsating in time with the creature's movements. The connection was clear. The altar was the source of the creature's power. Emily sprinted toward the altar, her heart pounding as the creature roared and gave chase. The ground shook beneath her feet, and the air grew thick with heat and energy. She could feel the creature's presence behind her, its claws swiping dangerously close as she reached the base of the altar. Didn't stop. Gripping the bat with both hands, she swung it with all her strength, striking the largest rune on the altar's surface. The impact sent a shockwave through the clearing, and the room cracked, its glow flickering. The creature let out an ear-piercing screech, its form convulsing as the light from the altar dimmed. Emily swung again and again, each strike shattering another rune and sending waves of energy rippling through the air. With one final blow, the altar final blow collapsed. The light erupted in a blinding flash, and Emily was thrown backward, her body slamming into the ground. The creature let out a final, deafening roar before it dissolved into shadow, its form scattering like smoke in the wind. The clearing fell silent. Emily lay on the ground, her chest heaving as she stared up at the dark sky. The pull in her chest was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The altars were destroyed, the seals were broken, and yet couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something far worse had been set free. Emily lay on the cold, cracked earth, her body aching as the weight of her journey pressed down on her. The clearing was eerily quiet now, the oppressive hum of the altar gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The air felt lighter, almost hollow, as if something vital had been drained from the world. She forced herself to sit up, her muscles screaming in protest. The shattered remains of the altar glimmered faintly in the pale moonlight. She had done it. The altars were destroyed. The pull in her chest was gone, but the emptiness that replaced it was far worse. Emily pushed herself to her feet, her broken bat slipping from her grasp and clattering to the ground. She didn't bother picking it up. The battle was over, but the victory felt hollow, incomplete. She stared at the space where the creature had stood, its massive form now nothing more than a memory. The whispers were gone, but their echoes lingered in her mind, faint and fragmented. "You cannot stop what comes next." Her chest tightened as the words replayed in her mind. What had she unleashed? The creature was gone, the altars destroyed, but the forest felt wrong, empty yet alive. As if holding its breath, Emily turned and stumbled toward the edge of the clearing, her legs weak and unsteady. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay here. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground itself was pulling her back. The trees seemed darker, their twisted branches casting jagged shadows that reached for her like claws as she made her way through the forest. She made her way through the forest. A faint sound broke the silence, a low rumble, deep and resonant, like distant thunder. Emily froze, her heart pounding as she scanned the darkness. The sound grew louder, reverberating through the trees and shaking the ground beneath her feet. "What now?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The rumble grew into a roar, and the earth beneath her feet cracked and splintered. Emily staggered back, her arms flailing as the ground opened in front of her, revealing a deep, glowing chasm. The light, glowing chasm was blinding, a sickly mixture of red, white, and green that pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat. From the chasm came a voice deep, ancient, and filled with a power that made Emily's skin crawl. "You were not meant to succeed." Emily's skin, breath caught in her throat as the light from the chasm intensified, illuminating the trees and casting long, shifting shadows. The voice was everywhere and nowhere, filling her mind and drowning out her thoughts. "The balance was not yours to restore." Tears streamed down Emily's face as she stepped back, her body trembling. "I didn't mean to," she stammered, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to stop it, to fix it." The voice let out a low, rumbling laugh, a sound that shook the very air around her. "You have undone what should have remained sealed. The altars were gates, and you have opened them all." Emily's stomach churned as the truth sank in. The altars weren't just seals, they were barriers, keeping something far worse locked away. And now they were gone. The light from the chasm shifted, forming shapes that twisted and writhed like living things. Shadows emerged from the glow, their forms indistinct but menacing, their movements fluid and unnatural. Emily stumbled back, her legs buckling as the shadows rose higher, towering over her. One of the figures stepped forward, its form solidifying into a humanoid shape. Its eyes burned with a blinding white light, and its presence was suffocating, filling the air with a crushing weight. When it spoke, its voice was layered, a cacophony of tones that echoed endlessly. "You have freed us?" Emily shook her head, her body trembling as she tried to make sense of the figure's words. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "I didn't know." "Ignorance does not absolve you," the figure interrupted, its tone cold and unyielding. "The balance is shattered, and now the world will feel the weight of its loss." Emily fell to her knees, her hands clutching the ground as tears streamed down her face. "What have I done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure stepped closer, its towering form casting a long shadow over her. "You have set us free, and now you will bear witness to the end." The other shadows began to move, their forms shifting and solidifying into grotesque shapes. Some were humanoid, others monstrous, their features twisted and alien. They spread out into the forest, their movements fluid and deliberate. As if they had a purpose, Emily forced herself to stand, her body trembling but defiant. "No," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "I won't let this happen. I'll stop you." The figure tilted its head, a faint smile playing across its lips. "You cannot stop what has already begun, but you may try." Before Emily could respond, the figure and the shadows vanished, dissolving into the air like smoke. The chasm sealed itself with a deafening crack, and the forest fell silent once more. Emily stood alone, her chest heaving as the weight of what she had unleashed pressed down on her. The altars were gone, the seals broken, but her fight was far from over. The whispers returned, faint and fragmented, their tone urgent and pleading. Emily clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what she was up against, but she wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. She turned and walked into the darkness, her steps steady and determined. The battle was over, but the war was just beginning. Emily trudged through the darkened forest, her heart pounding with each step. The oppressive silence was broken only by the faint echoes of her own breath and the distant, guttural hum of something vast and unseen. The pull in her chest, the force in her chest, the force that had guided her to the altars, was gone, replaced by a gnawing emptiness that felt worse than any physical pain. The weight of the voice's final words lingered in her mind. "You have set us free, and now you will bear witness to the end." The forest felt alive in a way that was wrong. The air seemed thicker, heavier, as though the trees themselves were watching her every move. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, pulsing faintly with an energy she couldn't name, gritted her teeth, clutching the broken bat tightly as she pushed forward, unsure of where she was going, but certain that stopping wasn't an option. Ahead, the forest began to change. The trees grew taller, their trunks warped and twisted like tortured figures frozen in time. Their bark was blackened, oozing a viscous liquid that shimmered faintly in the dim light. The air smelled acrid, a mix of burnt wood and something metallic, like rusted iron. Emily's stomach churned as she stepped carefully over the gnarled roots that jutted out of the ground, her eyes scanning for any movement in the shadows. And then she saw it. A figure stood in the distance, just barely visible through the tangled trees. It was humanoid. It's humanoid. Its silhouette unnervingly still, but its form was wrong. The edges of its body seemed to ripple and blur, as if it were made of smoke trying to hold a shape. Its head turned slowly toward her, and two glowing white eyes pierced through the darkness. Emily froze, her grip on the bat tightening as her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching her. Her pulse quickened, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs refused to obey. Then, without warning, the figure stepped forward. Its movements were slow and deliberate, each step silent as it closed the distance between them. Emily took a step back, her body trembling as the bat felt useless in her hands. The figure stopped a few feet away, its glowing eyes locked onto hers. When it spoke, its voice was layered, a cacophony of whispers that sent chills down her spine. "You were chosen." Emily's voice trembled as she forced herself to speak. Chosen forced herself to speak. What? The figure tilted its head, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. To restore what was lost, to bear the burden of what you have unleashed. Emily's stomach turned. "I destroyed the altars," she said, her voice rising. "I did what I was supposed to do." The figure's head tilted further, an eerie smile forming on its indistinct face. "You misunderstand. The altars were not barriers. They were anchors, holding back the true balance. And now, you must face what lies beyond." The ground beneath. Emily's feet began to tremble, and the air grew colder. The figure stepped closer, its form looming over her, and she stumbled back, her legs shaking. "I don't understand," she said, tears streaming down her face. "What am I supposed to do?" The figure reached out a hand, its long, shadowy fingers stretching toward her. "Follow the path. Seek the heart of the balance, or let it consume everything." Emily's breath hitched as the figure's hand grazed her shoulder, and a wave of finger out going with salty, with better noise your deeps. Searing pain shot through her body. She cried out, collapsing to her knees as visions flooded her mind. She saw the world, her world, breaking apart, cities crumbling, oceans boiling, the sky turning black, and at the center of it all, swirling mass of light and shadow, its form too vast and terrible to comprehend. The visions faded as the figure withdrew its hand, leaving Emily gasping for air. The forest around her seemed darker now, the shadows deeper and more oppressive. The figure's glowing eyes flickered as it stepped back into the darkness, its voice lingering in the air. "The choice is yours." Emily knelt on the ground, her body trembling as the figure disappeared. Her mind raced, replaying its words over and over. The altars had been anchors, not barriers. By destroying them, she had set something free, something ancient, powerful, and unstoppable. She forced herself to her feet, her legs weak and unsteady. The forest stretched endlessly before her, its twisted trees forming a labyrinth of shadows. The pull in her chest was gone, but a faint vibration in the air seemed to guide her forward, urging her toward an unknown destination. As she walked, the whispers returned, faint, and fragmented, their tone mournful and pleading. She didn't understand their words, but she could feel their meaning. They were warning her, begging her to hurry. The path narrowed, the air growing colder with each step. The trees seemed to press closer, their branches clawing at her like skeletal hands. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she pushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she reached it. The forest opened into a vast, barren expanse. The ground cracked and blackened like scorched earth. At the center stood a massive structure, its form twisting and shifting as if alive. It pulsed with a blinding light, a mixture of colors that seemed to defy description. The air around it shimmered, thick with energy that made her skin crawl. Emily stared at the structure, her body frozen in place. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it was the source, the heart of the balance, the thing she had unleashed, and it was waiting for her. Emily stood at the edge of the barren expanse, her body trembling as the sight of the massive, pulsating structure loomed before her. The ground beneath her feet was cracked and uneven, emitting faint pulses of heat with each vibration from the glowing monolith at the center. It wasn't just a structure, it was alive, its surface shifting and rippling like a breathing organism. The colors emanating from it twisted and bled into one another, casting an eerie glow that seemed to warp the very air around it. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to run, but her legs refused to move. The whispers in her head were gone, replaced by a deafening silence that made her heart pound even harder. Whatever this thing was, it was the culmination of everything she had endured. The altars, the seals, the creatures, it all led to this moment. The heart of the balance. As she stepped forward, the ground quaked, and a low, guttural hum filled the air. Emily froze, her eyes locked on the shifting form of the heart. The light from its surface grew brighter, pulsating in time with the vibrations beneath her feet. She clutched the broken bat tightly, knowing it was useless but unable to let it go. Come closer. The voice was deep and resonant, echoing in her mind rather than her ears. Emily flinched, her breath catching in her throat. The words weren't spoken, they were imposed, forced into her consciousness like a command. I know you, the voice continued, its tone both curious and mocking. You are the one who shattered the chains, the one who unbound the seals. Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. I didn't know what I was doing, she said, her voice trembling. I thought I was stopping something. The heart pulsed, the light from its surface flaring brightly for a moment. You stopped nothing, it said. You merely opened the door. Emily took another hesitant step forward, her legs shaking. Then tell me how to fix it, she said, her voice rising with desperation. Tell me what I have to do. The hum grew louder, vibrating through her chest. Fix it? The voice repeated, a note of amusement in its tone. There is no fixing what you have unleashed. The balance is broken, and the scales cannot be restored. Emily's fists clenched, tears streaming down her face. Then, why am I here? Why did you let me come this far? The heart shifted, its form twisting as if considering her words. You are here because you are the catalyst, it said, the one who began this, the one who must end it. Emily's stomach churned. End it, she whispered. How? The ground beneath her feet cracked violently, and she stumbled, barely catching herself. The heart pulsed brighter, its form expanding and contracting with each beat. To restore the balance, the voice said. You must give yourself to it. Emily's breath hitched. What does that mean? The light from the heart flared, bathing the barren expanse in an otherworldly glow. The balance requires a vessel, it said, a sacrifice. The power unleashed by your actions cannot be contained unless it is bound to something or someone. Emily's mind raced as the weight of its words sank in. It was asking her to take on the burden, to contain the chaos she had set free. The thought was terrifying, but she couldn't ignore the truth. This was the only way to stop it. Her hands trembled as she tightened her grip on the bat. And if I don't? She asked, her voice barely audible. The ground shook violently, and the heart's light burned brighter. Then the chaos will spread, the voice said. It will consume your world, your people, your everything. All will be lost. Emily's knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, her tears falling freely. She had fought so hard, endured so much, only to reach a choice that felt impossible. She didn't want to die, but the alternative was unthinkable. She took a deep, shuddering breath and forced herself to stand. Her legs wobbled, but she steadied herself, her gaze locked on the pulsating heart. If I do this, she said, her voice trembling but firm. Will it stop? Will the world be safe? The heart pulsed again, its light softening slightly. The balance will be restored, it said. The chaos contained, but you will cease to exist as you are. Emily's chest tightened. But she nodded. Then I'll do it. The heart flared. Then I'll do it, brightly, its form shifting as it seemed to reach out toward her. The air around her crackled with energy, and the ground beneath her feet began to glow. Emily closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face as she took a step forward. The light blade closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face as she took a step forward, enveloped her, and a searing pain shot through her body. She screamed, her voice echoing across the barren expanse as the energy consumed her. Her mind was flooded with visions, memories, images of the world she was saving, the faces of people she would never see again. And then there was silence, the pain faded, and Emily opened her eyes. She was no longer in the barren expanse. She was no longer in the barren expanse. She was nowhere. The heart was gone. The forest, the altars, all of it had disappeared. She floated in a vast empty void, her body weightless and her mind strangely calm. The voice returned, softer now, almost gentle. You have restored the balance, it said. The chaos is contained? Emily smiled faintly, a single tear slipping down her. She didn't know what came next, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt at peace, and then everything faded to black. The blackness was infinite, yet strangely soothing. Emily floated in it, her body weightless, her thoughts scattered like leaves on the wind. She had expected pain, fear, perhaps even regret, but instead, there was an odd sense of calm. She had done what she could. She had done what she could. She had saved the world. Hadn't she? The heart was contained, the balance restored. It was over, or so she thought. A faint light appeared in the void, distant and flickering like a dying star. Emily's chest tightened as she drifted toward it. Though she had no control over her movements, the light grew brighter, its shape shifting into something familiar yet unplaceable. It wasn't warm or inviting, it was sharp, cold, and clinical, like the glow of a fluorescent bulb. As she neared the light, a voice echoed in hers, not the ancient, resonant voice of the heart, but something different. It was fragmented, glitching, as though it was struggling to form coherent words. Subject detected, consciousness preserved, initiating containment. Emily's heart raced. What? She whispered, her voice trembling. Who's there? The light pulsed, and suddenly, the void shattered. She was yanked downward, her body spinning as the blackness dissolved into a whirlwind of images, sounds, and sensations. She felt herself falling, faster and faster, until she slammed into something solid. Her eyes flew open, and she gasped for air, her chest heaving as she struggled to sit up. She was no longer in the void. She was somewhere else, somewhere wrong. The room around her was sterile and cold, its walls smooth and cold. Its walls smooth and cold, metallic, lined with flickering screens that displayed streams of data she couldn't comprehend. The hum of machinery filled the air, and the faint scent of ozone stung her nose. Emily staggered to her feet, her legs shaky as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. Where am I? She murmured, her voice hoarse. A screen flickered to life in front of her, and a face appeared. It wasn't human. It was an amalgamation of shifting geometric patterns, its features constantly morphing into new shapes. When it spoke. Voice was monotone, devoid of any emotion. Subject 37A has successfully transitioned. Consciousness stabilized. Welcome to the containment nexus? Emily's stomach dropped. The containment nexus. What is this place? What's happening? What's happening? The figure on the screen tilted its head, the patterns on its face shifting like liquid metal. This is the core of the balance. Your actions have disrupted the natural order, necessitating your preservation within the nexus. You are the vessel now. Emily's breath hitched. No, that's not what I agreed to. I thought I was stopping it. I thought I was saving everyone. The figure's voice remained cold and detached. Your actions prevented annihilation. However, containment requires a conduit. Your consciousness has been integrated to maintain equilibrium. The process is irreversible. Panic surged through. What does that even mean? Am I dead? Am I alive? What happens to me now? The figure didn't answer immediately. The screens around her flickered, displaying distorted images of the altars, the forest, the creature she had faced. Finally, it spoke. You exist within the nexus. Your role is to sustain the balance. You restored. Without you, chaos would resume. Your individuality will erode over time as you merge with the system. Emily's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the cold, metallic floor. The words hit her like a physical blow. So, prisoner, she whispered. Forever. The figure's face shifted, its expression unreadable. Prisoner is a subjective term. You are a guardian now. Your sacrifice ensured the survival of your world. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she stared at the screen. But what about me? My life? My memories? Will I just disappear? The figure tilted its head again. Fragments of your consciousness will remain, scattered within the nexus. You will persist as echoes, guiding the balance when necessary. This is the price of restoration. Emily's hands clenched into fists assess. Despair washed over her. She had given everything to stop the chaos, to save the world. And now she was trapped, destined to fade into nothingness while the balance she fought so hard to protect remained intact. She slammed her fist against the floor, her voice rising in defiance. There has to be another way. I can't just vanish. There has to be a way to undo this. The figure didn't respond. The screens around her flickered, displaying streams of data and distorted images. Emily's breathing slowed as a new thought took root in her mind, a dangerous, impossible thought. What if she could break free? The Nexus was a system, wasn't it? And systems could be manipulated, broken, reprogrammed. If her consciousness was part of it now, then maybe, just maybe, she could use that to her advantage. Emily wiped the tears from her face, a spark of determination flickering in her face, a spark of determination flickering in her chest. She didn't know how, but she wasn't going to give up. Not yet. Fine, she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. You want me to be your guardian? I'll play along, but I'm not fading away quietly. If there's a way out of this, I'll find it. The figure's face remained expressionless, but the screens around her seemed to pulse faintly, almost as if the Nexus itself had heard her. Resolve is noted, the figure said. The Nexus adapts. We will see how long you endure. Emily stood, her fists clenched as she stared at the shifting patterns on the screen. The odds were against her, and the path ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear. Her fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself as she scanned the sterile room. The hum of machinery filled her ears, and the faint flicker of the screens seemed to taunt her. She wasn't going to let this be the end. If she was trapped inside the Nexus, then she would find a way to break free, or at least uncover its secrets. The system might have absorbed her, but she was still Emily, and she wasn't about to fade into nothingness. She began to move, her footsteps echoing softly against the metallic floor. The room seemed endless, stretching into darkness on all sides, but she felt a faint pull not like the one that had guided her to the altars, but something similar. It was as though the Nexus itself was nudging her forward. The screens around her flickered, displaying fragmented images. A forest blanketed in shadow, the glowing altars, and the towering figure she had faced. Whispers echoed faintly in the air, distorted and broken, as though the system were trying to communicate. Emily stopped, narrowing her eyes at one of the screens. The images were shifting rapidly, but one frame caught her attention. It was a face, her face. Subject 37A, the monotone voice from earlier intoned, its tone devoid of emotion. Consciousness instability detected. System recalibrating. Emily clenched her fists. You keep saying I'm part of this system, that I am the guardian, but you haven't told me anything that makes sense. What is this place? What's really going on? The screen flickered, and the geometric face from before reappeared. Its features were as unreadable as ever, but the voice was calm, almost patronizing. The Nexus exists to contain the forces that govern balance. Chaos, order, creation, destruction. You are now the vessel through which these forces are regulated. Emily stepped closer to the screen, her glare hard. You're saying I'm just a cog in your machine? The figure tilted its head slightly. Not a cog, the center without you. The balance collapses. Your role is essential. Essential, huh? Emily muttered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. And what happens to me? Do I just disappear? The figure paused for a moment, its face flickering slightly. You persist in fragments, in echoes, in purpose. Emily's chest tightened, anger bubbling beneath her fear. That's not living. That's erasing me. The screens around her pulsed, the images distorting as the hum of the machinery grew louder. This is the cost of balance, the voice said. You chose this. Emily slammed her fist against the nearest screen, the force sending a jolt of pain through her arm. Or you didn't choose this, she shouted. I was tricked. You gave me no other option. The room trembled faintly, the hum of the Nexus growing uneven. The screen flickered again, and for a brief moment, Emily saw something different. It wasn't her face or the shifting patterns. It was a map. Lines of energy, crisscrossed in intricate patterns, converging at a central point that pulsed faintly. That's the core, isn't it? Emily whispered, her eyes narrowing. The center of all this. The voice didn't respond immediately, but the screens began to flicker more violently. The hum grew louder, almost like a warning. You are not authorized to access that information. Emily smirked, her defiance flaring. Guess I'm on the right track. She turned, following the faint pull toward what she now believed was the core. The room shifted as she moved, the walls folding and rearranging themselves like a living maze. The screens continued to flicker, displaying distorted images that seemed designed to confuse her, but Emily ignored them. She had a purpose now, a goal, and she wasn't going to stop. The air grew colder as she moved deeper into the Nexus. The hum of the machinery became sharper, almost like a high-pitched whine, and the light from the screens dimmed. Emily's footsteps echoed louder, the sound bouncing off the metallic walls as the pull grew stronger. Finally, she reached a doorway. It wasn't like the rest of the Nexus. The edges of the frame shimmered faintly, and the space beyond was dark, pulsing with an ominous red light. Emily hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering near the edge of the frame. She didn't know what waited on the other side, but she knew it was important. She stepped through. The room beyond was massive, its walls lined with glowing conduits that pulsed with energy. At the center stood a towering structure. Its surface, smooth and black like obsidian. Lines of light crisscrossed its surface, converging at a single pulsating sphere that floated in midair. The sphere radiated power, its glow casting eerie shadows across the room. Emily approached cautiously, her chest tightening as the pull in her body became almost unbearable. The sphere seemed to react to her presence, its light flaring brighter as she drew closer. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing in her mind like a chorus of voices. "This is the core," the monotone voice said, its tone sharp and warning. "Do not proceed." Emily ignored it, her steps steady as she reached the base of the structure. She could feel the energy radiating from the sphere, its power vibrating from the sphere, its power vibrating through her body. Her fingers brushed against the surface of the structure, and a shock of pain shot through her, but she didn't pull back. "What happens if I destroy this?" she asked aloud, her voice trembling but resolute. The voice hesitated. "The nexus will collapse. Balance will be lost. Chaos will consume all." Emily closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "And if I don't, you will persist. The balance will remain. The world will survive." Her fingers tightened against the structure, her mind racing. She had fought so hard, sacrificed so much, only to end up here a prisoner in a system she barely understood. She barely understood, but now she had a choice. And this time, it was hers to make. Emily stood before the core, her fingers trembling against the smooth, pulsating surface of the structure. The light from the sphere cast her face in sharp shadows, illuminating. The conflict etched into her features. Every fiber of her being screamed with uncertainty, her thoughts a storm of doubt, anger, and resolve. The voice of the Nexus returned, sharp and resonant. "Do not proceed. The consequences will be irreversible." Emily's jaw tightened. She wasn't sure if the Nexus was trying to protect the balance or itself, but she didn't care anymore. She was done being a pawn, done being used. This was her moment, her choice, and she was going to make it. "What happens to me if I destroy the core?" she demanded, her voice shaking but firm. The hum of the Nexus grew louder, the sphere's glow pulsing faster. "You will cease to exist in all forms. Your consciousness will disintegrate. The balance will unravel and chaos will reign." Emily gritted her teeth, her hands curling into fists. "You keep saying that, but what if I'm the one who decides what happens next? What if I'm stronger than you think?" The Nexus didn't respond immediately, and for a moment the room fell silent. Then the voice returned, colder than before. "You are not strong enough to control the core. Your human limitations will fail you." "This is not defiance, it is futility." Emily's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. "Maybe, but I've come this far, haven't I? Let's see if you're right." She reached out, her palm pressing against the surface of the structure. The instant her skin touched it, a surge of energy coursed through her body, searing and electric. Emily screamed, her knees buckling as thieves. Power of the core tore through her, but she didn't let go. The light from the sphere flared brighter, filling the room with a blinding radiance. The voice of the Nexus grew frantic, its tone breaking for the first time. "Cease your actions! This will destroy everything." Emily gritted her teeth, her voice raw as she shouted back. "Maybe it will, but I'm not letting you decide my fate." With a surge of willpower, she pressed harder against the core. The pain was overwhelming, every nerve in her body on fire, but she didn't stop. Her mind filled with images, fractured memories, echoes of the altars, the creatures she had faced, the faces of the people she had fought to save. The weight of it all bore down on her, but she held firm. The core's light lit her. The core's light began to flicker, its steady pulse faltering. The hum of the Nexus turned into a deafening roar, the walls of the room trembling as cracks spread across their surface. Emily's vision blurred, her body trembling as the energy consumed her. And eventually, then, the core spoke, not in the cold, detached tone of the Nexus, but in a voice that was layered, ancient, and filled with a strange, sorrowful warmth. "Why do you fight?" Emily's breath hitched. her tears streaming freely as she forced herself to speak. Because I won't let you control me. I won't let you take away who I am. The voice paused, its tone softening. Your defiance is admirable, but to destroy that your defiance is admirable, but to destroy the core is to destroy yourself. Are you willing to pay that price? Emily hesitated, her hands trembling against the structure. The weight of the decision bore down on her, threatening to crush her resolve. She didn't want to die. She didn't want to disappear. But she couldn't live like this, trapped. Erased, used. Her gaze hardened, and she took a deep breath. If it means breaking free, then yes. The core pulsed brighter, and for a moment the room was filled with silence. Then the voice spoke again, its tone resigned. So be it. The tone resigned. So be it. Sphere's light flared, enveloping Emily in a searing glow. The pain was indescribable, a raw, all-consuming fire that tore through her body and mind. She screamed, her voice echoing through the room as the walls crumbled around her. The nexus reached a deafening crescendo, and then silence. When Emily opened her eyes, she was no longer in the nexus. She was standing in the middle of a vast, empty plain. The ground beneath her cracked and glowing faintly. The sky above was a swirling mass of light and shadow, shifting and alive. The air was still, heavy with an energy she couldn't name. She looked down at her hands, expecting them to feel different, but they were the same. She was the same, and yet she was the same, and yet she was the same, and yet wasn't. The voice returned, but it was no longer cold or detached. It was quiet, almost reverent. You have merged with the balance. You are no longer a vessel. You are the heart itself. Emily's chest tightened as the truth sank in. Hadn't destroyed the core, she had become it. The nexus was gone, the system shattered, but she remained, tethered to the fabric of the balance in a way she couldn't fully comprehend. What happens now? She whispered. The voice paused, its tone thoughtful. You decide. The balance is yours to shape. The chaos is yours to contain. The world is yours to protect. Emily's gaze lifted to the swirling sky, her fear giving way to a strange sense of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, the choice was hers. She took a step forward, her body glowing faintly with the light of the core. The world stretched out before her, infinite and unknown, waiting for her to leave her mark. And she would, because she was Emily, and this was only the beginning. Emily stood on the glowing, cracked plain, her body faintly radiating with the light of the core. She felt everything, the hum of the balance, the vibrations of chaos and order locked in their eternal struggle, and the faint, persistent whispers of the world she had fought so hard to save. The vast sky above her swirled endlessly, its colors bleeding together like a living storm. The voice bleeding together like a living storm. The voice of the core echoed softly in her mind. You hold the threads of balance now. The chaos will push, the order will resist, and you must decide how they dance. Emily closed her eyes, focusing on the sensations coursing through her. She felt tethered to something infinite, her existence stretching far beyond the limits of her physical form. It was overwhelming, but it was also empowering. She wasn't just a pawn in the nexus anymore. She was the center of it all. Show me. She was the center of it all, whispered. Show me the world. The ground beneath her shifted, and the glowing plain dissolved into mist. In an instant, she was somewhere else, suspended above the world she had saved. The view was breathtaking and terrifying. She could see everything, as though her perspective stretched across continents. Cities pulsed with life. Oceans churned under restless skies, and forests whispered with ancient energy. But everywhere she looked, she saw cracks, small, subtle fractures in it, the fabric of reality, rippling outward like scars. The balance wasn't stable. The world teetered on the edge, held together only by her presence. She reached out instinctively, her hand brushing against the fractures, and the cracks shimmered against the fractures. And the cracks shimmered faintly before fading, but for every crack she mended, another seemed to appear. The voice returned, calm but insistent. The balance requires constant vigilance. It is not a task of moments, but of eternity. Are you prepared for that burden? Emily's throat tightened. She thought of everything she had fought for, the people she had saved, the sacrifices she had made. Her heart ached at the thought of what she had lost, but she couldn't let it end here. Yes, she said firmly. I'll do whatever it takes. The world shifted again, the fractures fading as she was pulled back into the glowing void. But this time, she wasn't alone. Figures began to materialize around her shadowy forms, their edges undefined. Weren't like the creatures she had fought. These felt familiar, as though they were echoes of something she had once known. What are they? Emily asked, her voice trembling. Fragments, the voice replied. Pieces of those who have come before, guardians who held the balance in ages past. They linger, guiding, watching. You are not the first, and you will not be the last. One of the figures stepped forward, its form solidifying slightly. It was a woman, her face lined with age and wisdom, her eyes glowing faintly with the same light that surrounded Emily. She smiled softly, her voice gentle but firm. You're stronger than most, the woman said. The Nexus chose well. Emily frowned, her hands curling into fists. I didn't want to be chosen. I just wanted to stop it. The woman's smile faded, her gaze turning serious. No one ever wants this, she said. But the balance doesn't ask for permission. It demands sacrifice. Emily's shoulders sagged as the weight of her role settled over her. Will it always be like this? She asked. Endless cracks, endless chaos. Will it ever get better? The woman hesitated, her expression unreadable. That depends on you, she said. The balance isn't fixed. It's alive, constantly shifting. You have the power to shape it, to guide it, but it will never be easy. The other figures nodded silently, their forms flickering like candle flames. Emily looked around at them, her resolve hardening. She didn't fully understand what lay ahead, but she knew one thing. She couldn't give up now. What do I do first? She asked, her voice steady. The woman smiled again, her form beginning to dissolve into the light. Listen, the balance will tell you where to begin. As the figures faded, Emily felt a surge of energy flow through her. The glowing void around her pulsed rhythmically, and the fractures she had seen earlier flickered faintly in her mind's eye. She could feel them now like threads pulling at her, each one leading to a different part of the world. She closed her eyes, focusing on the closest thread. It pulsed with urgency, its energy sharp and chaotic. Without hesitation, she reached for it, and the world shifted once more. Emily found herself standing in the middle of a desolate village. The buildings were crumbling, their walls blackened by fire. The air was thick with ash, and the faint sound of whispers echoed on the wind. She could feel the imbalance here, raw and unrelenting, like a wound that refused to heal. Her presence stirred the whispers, and the shadows around her began to move. Shapes emerged from the darkness, twisted, malformed figures, their eyes glowing faintly. They weren't real, not entirely. They were manifestations of the chaos, feeding on the imbalance that had taken root in this place. Emily's heart raced as the figures closed in, their movements jerky and unnatural, but she didn't back down. She could feel the core's energy within her, a steady rhythm that pulsed in time with the world around her. She raised her hand, and the light within her flared. The figures recoiled, hissing as the glow illuminated the darkness. Emily stepped forward, her voice firm. "This isn't your place," she said. "Go back to the shadows." The light grew brighter, and the figures dissolved into smoke, their forms scattering on the wind. The whispers faded, and the village grew still, but Emily could still feel the imbalance, lingering beneath the surface like a dormant storm. She knelt on storm, the scorched earth, her hands pressing against the ground. The core's energy flowed through her, seeping into the cracks and fractures that scarred the village. The air grew lighter, the ash dissipating as the balance began to shift. When she stood, the village was quiet. The chaos had been contained, at least for now. Emily turned, her gaze lifting to the horizon. There were more threads, more fractures to mend. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time she felt ready. Emily lingered in the quiet aftermath of the village's restoration, her body still thrumming with the energy of the core. She looked around at the silent streets, the soot-streaked walls now standing firm and whole, and felt a flicker of relief for all the weight she bore, for all the impossibility of her task. She had made a difference here. It was small single thread in a tapestry of fractures. It mattered. The faint pull in her chest returned, softer now, less urgent. It guided her gaze toward the horizon, where shadows still loomed, fractured and restless. She knew there was no time to rest. The balance was delicate, its threads stretched thin, and chaos would not wait for her to gather her strength. But this time, she didn't feel entirely alone. The memory of the shadowy figures, the echoes of guardians who had come before her, gave her courage. Their words lingered in her mind, quiet but steady. "Listen, feel, the balance will tell you where you begin." Emily closed her eyes and reached out with her senses, letting the pull guide her. The world around her shifted again, the air growing colder, sharper, as the village faded into nothingness. She felt herself moving, weightless, as if carried by an unseen current. When she opened her eyes, she stood at the edge of a vast frozen lake. The ice stretched endlessly before her, its surface fractured with jagged cracks that glowed faintly in the dim light. The sky above was an unnatural shade of gray, heavy with swirling clouds that seemed to press down on the landscape. The air was bitterly cold, and Emily's breath formed visible clouds as she exhaled. She took a cautious step forward, the ice groaning beneath her. Wait, the pull in her chest was stronger now, guiding her toward the center of the lake. She could see something there, a faint, flickering light that pulsed in time with the energy she carried. It felt familiar, but also wrong, as though it didn't belong here. As she moved closer, the whispers returned. They were faint at first, fragmented and indistinct, but they grew louder with each step. Emily stopped, her breath catching as she realized the whispers weren't coming from the ice or the air. They were coming from beneath her feet. She knelt, her hand brushing against the frozen surface of the lake. The whispers intensified, their tone urgent, pleading. She could feel the imbalance here, deep and powerful, like a wound that refused to heal. The cracks in the ice glowed brighter, pulsating with chaotic energy that threatened to break free. Emily pressed her palm against the ice, the core's energy flowing through her like a steady current. The whispers grew louder, their fragmented words coalescing into something she could almost understand. Trapped, forgotten, release us. Her chest tightened as the realization hit her. Whatever was beneath the ice wasn't just a fracture in the balance. It was alive, or at least it had been. She rose to her feet, her gaze fixed on the flickering light at the lake center. The pull in her chest was insistent now, urging her forward, but her steps were slow, cautious. The ice, groaned louder with each movement, the cracks spreading beneath her feet. When she reached the center, the light flared, blinding her for a moment. She shielded her eyes, her heart pounding as the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. The ice beneath her feet trembled, and she staggered, barely keeping her balance. "Who's there?" she called, her voice echoing across the frozen expanse. The light pulsed again, and the ice beneath her shattered. Emily cried out as she plunged into the freezing water, the cold piercing her like 1,000 needles. The whispers surrounded her now, louder and more urgent, as though the lake itself were alive. She thrashed, struggling to surface, but the pull dragged her deeper, and then she saw it beneath the lake. Something stirred. It was massive, its form indistinct but undeniably alive. Its body was entwined with the glowing cracks in the ice, its movement sluggish and heavy, as though it had been trapped for centuries. Its eyes opened, glowing faintly in the dark water, and they locked onto Emily. She froze, her body suspended in the freezing depths as the creature studied her. Its presence was overwhelming, its energy ancient and suffocating. The whispers grew softer, merging into a single voice, low, resonant, and filled with despair. "You are not the one we called for, but you have come. Why?" Emily's mind raced as she struggled to find her voice. "I'm here to fix this," she said, her words trembling but firm. "To restore the balance." The creature's eyes narrowed, and the water around her seemed to ripple with its emotions. "Balance," it said, the word dripping with bitterness. "There is no balance, only chains, only prisons." Emily's chest tightened as the creature's words sank in. "The altars," she whispered. "They weren't just anchors, they were cages." The creature's form shifted, its glowing eyes burning brighter. "We were bound by the Nexus, forgotten, sacrificed, and now you carry its light, you are its jailer." Emily's breath caught as the creature surged closer, its massive form filling her vision. She could feel its power, its rage, but beneath it all, there was something else. Pain, grief. "I didn't know," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought I was saving the world." The creature paused, its glowing eyes softening slightly. "Ignorance does not absolve you, but perhaps it gives you purpose." Emily reached out instinctively, her hand brushing against the creature's shimmering form. The core's energy flared within her, and the whisper's energy flared within her, and the whispers returned, softer now, like a distant chorus. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How do I fix this?" The creature's voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. "Free us, but know this. To unbind us is to unbind yourself. The balance will break once more, and you may not survive." Emily closed her eyes, the weight of the choice pressing down on her. She had fought so hard, sacrificed so much, and now she was faced with yet another impossible decision. But as she opened her eyes and met the creature's gaze, she knew what she had to do. She wasn't just a guardian. She was Emily, and she would decide what balance meant. Taking a deep breath, she reached deeper into the core's energy, her resolve unshakable. "I'll set you free." Emily drifted deeper into the freezing water, her chest tightening as the weight of her decision bore down on her. The flickering light from the fractured ice above barely illuminated the massive, ancient creature before her. It moved sluggishly, its glowing eyes fixed on her, both patient and expectant. She clutched the core's energy within her, its warmth clashing against the icy grip of the water. The creature's whispers had faded, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against her mind. Her body ached, her lungs burned, but she couldn't turn back now. "You said freeing you would break the balance," Emily said, her voice trembling but steady. "But you didn't say what would happen next." The creature's eyes glimmered, its form shifting slightly in the water. Its voice returned, low and resonant, reverberating through her mind. "The balance is an illusion, chains disguised as order. To break it is to unmake what should never have been made. What follows is uncertain." Emily's pulse quickened. "Uncertain? You mean chaos?" The creature tilted its massive head, the faint glow of its body pulsing. "Not chaos, freedom. The world will find its own balance if it survives." Emily's breath hitched. "If it survives," she repeated, the words heavy on her tongue. "And me? What happens to me?" The creature's gaze softened, almost mournful. "You are bound to the light. If the balance breaks, so do you." She felt a cold dread wash over her, deeper than the icy water around her. Yet, somewhere beneath the fear, there was a flicker of fear, a resolve. She had come this far. She had sacrificed everything to stop the nexus, to restore what she thought was right. Could she stop now, knowing what she knew? No. Her fists clenched as she stared into the creature's glowing eyes. "Then so be it, if it means freedom for you. For the world, then I'll break the chains." The creature seemed to nod, its form growing brighter, more defined. The water around them began to ripple violently, the cracks in the ice above spreading and glowing brighter. Emily's heart raced as the pull of the core's energy intensified, surging through her veins like fire. "Then let it begin," the creature said. "Then it begin," the creature said, its voice a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. "But know this, guardian, the world you leave behind will not remember you. Only the light remains." Emily's tears mingled with the icy water as the creature's words sank in. She had no one left to remember her, no ties to the life she had known. Maybe that made this easier, or maybe it made it infinitely harder. She pressed her hand to the creature's shimmering form, the core's energy flaring within her. The whispers returned, louder now, urgent and desperate. The light from the cracks in the ice grew blinding, and the water around them churned violently as the energy began to flow between her and the creature. Pain surged through her body raw, searing, all-consuming. She surged through her body, raw, searing, all-consuming, screamed, though no sound escaped her lips. The world around her fractured, the ice above shattering into a cascade of light and shadow. She felt herself unraveling, her consciousness scattering like fragments of glass caught in a storm. And then, everything went still. When Emily opened her eyes, she was no longer in the frozen lake. She stood in an endless expanse of light and shadow, the boundaries between the two shifting and blurring. Her body felt weightless, her mind quiet but aware. The creature was gone, its presence replaced by a faint hum that echoed through the expanse. She looked down at her hands, which glowed faintly with the core's energy. She was no longer just Emily. She was something more, something less. The weight of her choices lingered, but the chaos she had feared was absent. The balance was gone, and yet the world still turned. A voice echoed softly, distant but familiar. It wasn't the creature's voice or the nexus it weighs. It wasn't the creature's voice or the nexus it was her own. "You are free." Emily smiled faintly, her tears glistening like stars in the endless expanse. She didn't know what came next. Perhaps this was the end, or perhaps it was a beginning. Whatever it was hers. And for the first time, she felt whole.